Welcome to our History for Sleep. Tonight, our story follows a man born into the most powerful and feared family on earth. His grandfather was Genghis Khan, a man who united a nation and began to conquer the world. But this is the story of the grandson, a man who inherited not only a great name, but also a dangerous family conflict. This is the story of Batu Khan, and how he forged an empire of his own. In the first years of the 13th century, the world was a mosaic of ancient empires and scattered kingdoms. In the Far East, China was divided. The Jin dynasty ruled the north, the southern Song dynasty held the south, and other states like the Xia held crucial segments of the Silk Road. In the Middle East, the powerful Khwarezmian Empire stretched from Persia to India, controlling immense wealth and vast armies. And in the West, Europe was a patchwork of feudal states. Knights in heavy armor were the dominant military force, and kings bickered over territory, largely unaware of the lands that lay beyond the forests of what is now Russia. This world felt stable, permanent. Its rulers believed they understood the rules of war and politics. They were all wrong. Because far away, in the harsh, wind-swept plains of Mongolia, a revolution was underway. This revolution was not just a change of ruler. It was the creation of an entirely new kind of society. For centuries, the steppe had been home to countless nomadic tribes: Tatars, Karaits, Merkits, Naimans, and many others. They were brilliant horsemen and lethal archers, but they spent most of their energy fighting each other. They raided each other's camps, stole horses, and swore oaths of loyalty that were broken just as quickly. It was a world of constant, low-level warfare. Then one man changed everything. His name was Temujin, and the world would come to know him as Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan's genius was not just military. It was social and political. He didn't just defeat the other tribes. He absorbed them. He broke down the old tribal loyalties, which had caused so much division, and reorganized his entire people into a new system based on military rank. This system was called the Tumun, a unit of 10,000 soldiers. This was further divided into units of 1,000, 100, and 10. Your loyalty was no longer to your local tribe or chieftain. It was to your commander, to your unit, and ultimately to the Khan himself. He created a nation that was an army. Every man, from his teenage years to old age, was a soldier. Their society was a military machine. To bind this new nation together, he gave them a law, the Yassa. The Yassa was a code that governed everything from theft, punishable by death, to adultery, also death, to the rules of diplomacy. But its most important rule was absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the Khan. This new Mongol nation, born around 1206, was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was disciplined, meritocratic, meaning you were promoted for skill, not just for your family name, and utterly ruthless. And it was driven by a single powerful idea, given to them by Genghis Khan, that Tengri, the great sky god, had given them the entire world to rule. This belief turned the endless, chaotic energy of the steppe outward. Instead of raiding each other, the Mongols would now raid the world. This is the world into which our story's hero, Batu, was born around the year 1209. He was not born into a simple nomadic tribe, struggling for survival. He was born into the royal family of a brand new superpower that was, at that very moment, beginning to shatter the old world. His grandfather, Genghis Khan, was his living relative, his supreme commander. While Batu was a child, learning to ride a horse almost before he could walk, he wasn't just hearing ancient legends. He was hearing breaking news. He heard how his grandfather's armies had breached the Great Wall and smashed the armies of the Jin dynasty in China. He heard how they had learned new, terrible forms of warfare from captured Chinese engineers, how to build siege engines, giant crossbows, and catapults that could smash city walls. He heard the story of the Khwarezmian Empire, how the Shah had foolishly executed Mongol ambassadors, and he heard how his grandfather, in response, unleashed a war of annihilation so total that it wiped one of the world's most powerful empires off the map in less than 2 years. This was not history to young Batu. This was his family's business. He grew up in an atmosphere of total war and limitless ambition. The assumption was not if they would conquer, but what they would conquer next. But Batu's position in this royal family was not as secure as it seemed. He was the grandson of the great Khan, yes, but he was also the son of a man named Jochi. And Jochi carried with him a shadow, a secret that threatened to undermine his entire legacy, and the future of his son, Batu. This secret would shape Batu's personality, fuel his ambition, and create a bitter rivalry that would one day nearly tear the new Mongol Empire apart. The shadow that defined Batu Khan's life was not his own, but his father's. His father was Jochi, the first son of Genghis Khan. Jochi's story begins long before his father was the great Khan, back when he was just a young warrior named Temujin, trying to unite the tribes. He had a new wife named Borte. She was the love of his life, a politically important match, and the future mother of his dynasty. Shortly after their marriage, disaster struck. A rival tribe, the Merkits, launched a surprise raid on their camp. This was an act of brutal revenge. Years earlier, Temujin's father had stolen his mother from a Merkit warrior. Now, the Merkits came to settle the score. In the chaos, Temujin escaped, but Borte was captured. Temujin was devastated, but he was also relentless. It took him months, but he gathered his allies. His blood brother Jamukha and his patron, Togrul Khan. Together, they raised an army and smashed the Merkit tribe, scattering them to the winds. Temujin personally rode through the wreckage of the enemy camp and found Borte. He had saved her. It was a great victory, but it was complicated. Borte was pregnant. She had been a captive for months. No one knew for certain, not even her, who the father was. Was it Temujin, conceived just before her capture? Or was it one of her Merkit captors? Soon after her rescue, she gave birth to a son. Temujin, in a public act of acceptance, named him Jochi. The name Jochi in Mongolian means guest. It was a polite, ambiguous name. A guest in the world, or a guest in Temujin's family. The doubt was baked into his very identity. Temujin himself never once wavered in public. He declared, "He is my eldest son." He treated Jochi with all the honor due to the firstborn. He accepted him. But the world, and more importantly, his other children, did not. As Borte later gave birth to more sons, Subutai, Ogdi, and Talyui, the Jochi problem only grew. The other 3 boys were undeniably Temujin's. They were pure-blooded. Jochi was the guest. The one who personified this conflict was the second son, Subutai. Subutai was a harsh, unyielding man. He was a strict legalist, obsessed with the rules and the Yassa, the great law. To him, the purity of the bloodline was everything. He saw Jochi not as a brother, but as a Merkit bastard. And he was not quiet about it. This simmering resentment boiled over into one of the most famous and critical scenes in Mongol history. One day, Genghis Khan gathered his sons to discuss the future of the empire, to decide who would be his heir. He began by asking Jochi, as the eldest, to speak. Before Jochi could even open his mouth, Subutai exploded. "How can we let this bastard of a Merkit speak first?" he shouted. "How can we accept his command?" The tent fell silent. This was not just a family argument. It was high treason. It was a direct challenge to Genghis Khan's own word. Jochi was furious. He lunged at Subutai, and the 2 brothers began to brawl on the floor of their father's tent, right in front of the great Khan. Genghis Khan's guards had to pull them apart. The Khan was deeply, profoundly wounded. Not by the doubt, He had lived with that for decades. He was wounded by the division. "How can you speak this way?" he demanded of Subutai. "Jochi is my eldest son. The sky has ordained this." But the damage was done. The poison was in the well. Because of this fight, Genghis Khan passed over both Jochi and Subutai. He deemed them too hot-headed, their rivalry too dangerous. He ultimately chose his third son, the calm, diplomatic Ogdi, to be his heir. Jochi was now forever an outsider in his own family. When Genghis Khan divided the empire among his sons, assigning them their Ulus, their allotted territory, he gave Jochi the lands furthest to the west. These were the lands of modern-day Kazakhstan, Russia, and the steppe lands that, crucially, had not yet been conquered. Was this an honor, the right of the eldest to expand the empire? Or was it a polite form of exile? A way to keep the problem son as far away from the Mongol heartland as possible? The truth is likely a bit of both. Jochi became a capable ruler, but he was known to be melancholic, brooding. He felt the shadow of his birthright every day. And this entire heavy, toxic inheritance was passed directly to his son Batu. Batu was Jochi's second son, but his older brother Orda was known to be pious and quiet. Orda recognized his younger brother's superior ambition and strength of will, and stepped aside, allowing Batu to become the effective heir to Jochi's Ulus. So Batu didn't just inherit land. He inherited his father's problem. He inherited the shadow. He inherited the stain of being the grandson of the guest. He inherited the open hostility of his uncle, Subutai. And he inherited the simmering resentment of his cousins, Sugutai's sons, and the sons of Ogdi, particularly a man named Güyük. Batu grew up knowing that a significant portion of his own family, the most powerful men in the world, did not believe he belonged. They saw him as tainted, as illegitimate. This was the political time bomb at the heart of the Mongol royal family, and it would shape every single decision Batu Khan would make. This internal family conflict was the forge in which Batu's personality was hammered into shape. He was not like his cousins, the sons of Subutai and Ogdi. They had the luxury of arrogance, the comfort of an unquestioned bloodline. They were the pure grandsons of Genghis Khan. Batu had no such luxury. From his earliest memories, he would have understood that his position was conditional. It was not enough for him to simply be a prince. He had to prove he deserved to be one every single day. When his cousins looked at him, he would have seen the flicker of doubt in their eyes, the unspoken question. He was the son of Jochi, the guest. This constant, quiet pressure does one of two things to a person. It either breaks them or it turns them into steel. For Batu, it was steel. This meant his ambition was of a different kind. It was not just a desire for power. It was a desperate need for validation. He had to be more successful, more disciplined, and more ruthless than his rivals. Where they might be complacent, he had to be vigilant. Where they might be sentimental, he had to be pragmatic. He could never afford to show weakness, because any weakness would be seen as proof of his tainted blood. He likely learned to trust no one outside his immediate family. The wider world of the Mongol court was not a place of relatives. It was a nest of vipers. His uncles and cousins were not allies. They were competitors, waiting for him to fail. His entire life became an exercise in proving his legitimacy. Even his name was a testament to this. His father was Jochi, the guest, a name defined by ambiguity and doubt. But Jochi and his wife, Yukai Fujin, gave their son a name that was the exact opposite. They named him Batu. In Mongolian, Batu means firm, solid, strong, or reliable. It was not a name of chance. It was a mission statement. It was a command. You will not be the guest. You will be the rock. You will be the one who is firm, the one who can be relied upon. Batu spent his entire life living up to that name. This psychology also defined his relationships. While he was deeply suspicious of his uncles and cousins, he was, by all accounts, fiercely loyal to his own branch of the family. He and his brothers were in this together. They were the Jochi line, the outsiders. His older brother, Orda, was a quiet and deeply religious man. He saw his younger brother's iron will and political mind. In a remarkable act of fraternal loyalty, Orda willingly stepped aside, ceding his birthright as the eldest son of Jochi to Batu. He recognized that Batu was the leader their branch of the family needed to survive the political battles ahead. This was not a power struggle. It was a strategic decision. Orda would serve Batu, and in doing so protect them all. His younger brother, Burke, was different. He was fierce, passionate, and a brilliant commander in his own right. Batu cultivated a powerful alliance with Burke. They were a team. Batu was the cold, calculating strategist. Burke was the fiery fist. Together, they made the Ulus of Jochi a formidable power. Batu also drew strength from his mother's side. His mother, Yukai Fujin, was from the Conqueror, one of the most prestigious tribes in Mongolia. This was the same tribe as Genghis Khan's great wife, Borte. This was a political masterstroke. It was as if Jochi, by marrying her, was trying to wash away the Merkit stain from his lineage. Batu was not just the grandson of the questionable Jochi. He was also the great-nephew of the Empress Borte, a man connected by blood to the purest maternal line. He would use these Conqueror connections brilliantly throughout his life to build alliances and counter his rivals. So, the young prince that emerged in the 1220s was a complex and dangerous man. He was cold, calculating, and deeply mistrustful of his relatives in the Mongol heartland. He was bound by an ironclad loyalty to his own brothers, who saw him as their champion. And he was driven by a relentless, burning ambition. An ambition to prove once and for all that he was not the grandson of the guest. He was a true grandson of Genghis Khan, a rock, a Batu. And he would do it by accomplishing the one great task his family had left unfinished. He would take the armies of the empire and march west, further than his grandfather had ever dreamed. He had everything to prove, and he would prove it to the world. But ambition alone was not enough. Before Batu could prove his worth to the world, he had to master the skills of his people. His education did not take place in palaces or libraries. It took place on the vast, unforgiving steppe, an environment that served as both a classroom and a filter, weeding out the weak. A European prince might learn Latin, philosophy, and the rules of chivalry. A Mongol prince learned three things: the horse, the bow, and endurance. His education in horsemanship began almost as soon as he could walk. By the age of 3, a Mongol boy was tied to the saddle of a horse and taught to ride. By 4 or 5, he would be given his first small bow and arrows and would hunt small game from horseback. This was not a hobby. The horse was the foundation of Mongol life. It was their transportation, their mobile weapons platform, and their source of sustenance. The Mongols drank arag, fermented mare's milk, which allowed them to travel vast distances without relying on vulnerable supply wagons. A Mongol warrior would have a string of several horses, switching mounts to keep them fresh, allowing him to cover 100 miles a day. Batu would have spent more of his childhood in the saddle than on his own feet. He learned to sleep while riding, to twist his body and fire arrows accurately in any direction, to become so fused with his mount that horse and rider moved as a single creature. The second skill was the bow. A Mongol prince did not wield the simple wooden self-bow used in Europe. He mastered the Mongol composite bow. This was a marvel of engineering, a recurved weapon made of laminated layers of sinew, wood, and horn, bound together with fish glue. It was short enough to be used easily from horseback, but when strung, it curved into a lethal C shape, unleashing an arrow with terrifying force, enough to pierce the mail and light plate armor of a European knight or a Chinese infantryman. Mastering this weapon took a lifetime. It required immense strength and precision. Batu would have practiced for hours every day, shooting at targets, then at running game. Hunting was not sport. It was constant military training. But the final and most important piece of his education was endurance. This was what separated the Mongols from all their enemies. They were trained to endure conditions that would destroy other armies. They could go for days on a few strips of dried milk curd, or if desperate, they would puncture a vein on one of their horses, drink a cup of its blood, and seal the wound. They operated in the shattering cold of the Siberian winter and the blistering heat of the Persian desert. This endurance was formalized in the Nurj, the Great Hunt. The Nurj was the final examination of the Steppe Academy, and it was one of Genghis Khan's greatest inventions. This was not a small group of nobles chasing deer. The Nurj was a massive military operation, sometimes held in the dead of winter. A vast line of horsemen, thousands strong, would form a circle that could be hundreds of miles in circumference. On command, this great circle would begin to move inward slowly over a period of weeks, sometimes even months. They made an incredible noise, beating drums and shouting, driving every living animal inside that circle. Wolves, deer, foxes, wild boars, toward a central killing ground. The discipline required was absolute. No warrior was allowed to let a single animal break through his section of the line. To do so was a failure not just of hunting, but of military duty, and was severely punished. This taught thousands of men to move as one, to coordinate over vast distances, and to maintain iron discipline for weeks on end. When the circle had finally tightened, and the panicked, churning mass of animals was trapped, the Khan himself would ride in and fire the first arrow. Then the princes would follow. And finally, the entire army would descend, slaughtering the animals in a terrifying spectacle of training. Batu would have participated in this from a young age, and as he grew, he would have been given command of his own section of the line. He learned how to coordinate thousands of men. He learned how to enforce discipline. And he learned how to be ruthless. This was Batu's education. By the time he was a teenager, he was not a pampered prince. He was a graduate of the most brutal and effective military academy on earth. He was a master of logistics, a disciplined commander, and a hardened killer. He had learned the law of the Yassa, and he had proven himself in the Nurj. He was ready for his first taste of real war. The skills of the Nurj, the endurance, the coordination, the ruthlessness, were the hardware of the Mongol military machine. But the operating system, the code that ran that machine and bound every warrior to a single purpose, was something else. It was his grandfather's other great invention, the Great Yassa. The Yassa was the supreme law code of Genghis Khan. To understand Batu, we must understand this code because it wasn't just a set of rules for him, it was the foundation of his identity. Before Genghis Khan, the steppe was a place of endless chaos. The highest law was revenge. If someone stole from you, you stole back. If someone killed your relative, you started a blood feud that could last for generations. There was no trust, and therefore no possibility of a large, stable society. The Yassa ended this. It was a social revolution enforced with iron. Many of its laws were brutally practical, designed for a nomadic society. Consider theft. In a settled European town, if someone steals your tools, it is a crime. In the steppe, if someone steals your horse or your sheep, it is a death sentence. You will starve. The Yassa was simple. You steal, you die. This wasn't abstract justice. It was a matter of survival. This single law created a level of trust that had never existed in Mongolia. Travelers reported that you could leave a gold nugget on the road and no one would dare touch it. The Yassa also forbade adultery, again, punishable by death. Genghis Khan was not a moralist. He was a pragmatist. He knew that feuds over women and questions of paternity could tear an army apart from the inside. He had seen it. The Yassa was designed to eliminate all internal conflict, so that all the energy of the nation could be focused outward. But the most powerful laws were military. The Yassa is what truly made the Mongol army invincible. It institutionalized the unit of 10, the Arban. This unit was not just a military formation. It was a pact of shared responsibility. If one man in your Arban was captured, and you did not try to rescue him, you were executed. If one man in your Arban dropped his weapons, and you did not ride back to retrieve them for him, you were executed. And most famously, if one man in your unit of 10 turned and ran in battle, he was not the only one executed. All 10 of you were executed. Imagine the psychological effect of this law. It created a bond stronger than steel. It made routing a Mongol army virtually impossible. A soldier would rather charge into certain death at the hands of the enemy than face the shame and certainty of execution from his own comrades. It replaced individual fear with collective, unbreakable duty. And at the very top of this legal pyramid, the highest law of all was one single, simple concept: absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the Khan. To question the Khan was to question the Yassa. To question the Yassa was to question the order of the universe, and it was punishable by death. Now consider what this law meant for young Batu. His uncle, Subutai, the man who had called his father a bastard, was known as the great guardian of the Yassa. He was the legalist, the enforcer. This set up a bitter paradox. Subutai and his followers used the Yassa to enforce their idea of blood purity, implying Batu and his father were outside that law. Batu's response was not to reject the Yassa. His response was to become its greatest champion. He could not change his blood. He could not erase the shadow of his father, Jochi. But he could be the most loyal, most disciplined, most rigid and ruthless enforcer of his grandfather's code. He would be more Batu, more firm, than anyone. This is the key to his personality. Batu's coldness, his calculating nature, his later reputation for being stern and unyielding, was not just his temperament. It was a political strategy. He wrapped himself in the armor of the Yassa. When he punished failure, he wasn't being cruel. He was enforcing the code. When he demanded absolute loyalty, he wasn't being a tyrant. He was upholding the first law of the empire. He could not win the argument about blood, so he decided to win the argument about loyalty. This made him the perfect instrument of his grandfather's will. He was a graduate of the brutal physical academy of the steppe, and a true believer in the ironclad ideology of the Yassa. He was strong, he was disciplined, and he had a deep personal need to prove his worth. By the mid-1220s, Batu was no longer a child. He was a prince of the blood, a master of the hunt, and a true believer in the law. He was ready to join his family's business, the conquest of the world. Batu was now a man. He was forged by the steppe, disciplined by the Yassa, and driven by a deep need to prove his legitimacy. He was ready to take his place as a commander in his grandfather's armies, to finally demonstrate his loyalty and his strength. But just as he came of age, the entire world he had been trained for was turned upside down. The year 1227 changed everything. The first blow fell early in the year, and it came from within his own family. His father, Jochi, died. The circumstances of his death are one of the great mysteries of the Mongol Empire. Jochi had been ruling his distant western Ulus for years. He had become increasingly withdrawn, melancholic, and distant from the Mongol heartland. He began to see his assigned lands not just as a territory, but as his own kingdom. The final rupture came when Genghis Khan summoned him to join a new campaign. Jochi refused. He sent a message to his father claiming he was too ill to travel. This was an act of profound defiance. It was a violation of the Yassa, which demanded total obedience. Genghis Khan was suspicious. His spies soon reported that Jochi was not ill. In fact, he was healthy enough to be conducting his own great hunts in the steppe. To Genghis Khan, this was the ultimate treason. His son, the guest, was not just disobedient. He was carving out his own empire, acting as a rival Khan. The great Khan was enraged. According to the chroniclers, he declared, "It seems my son has gone mad. I will order him to be brought to me." He gave the command to assemble an army to march west, to punish and perhaps destroy his own firstborn son. A catastrophic civil war within the royal family seemed inevitable. But before Genghis Khan could march, a new messenger arrived from the west. Jochi was dead. The official cause was his lingering illness. But no one believed it. Had he died of sickness? Or had an assassin's poison, sent by a furious Genghis Khan, reached him first? Was it a convenient coincidence? Or was it a state execution? We will never know. But imagine the impact on Batu. He was around 18 years old. His father was dead, not as a hero, but in disgrace under the shadow of treason. This did not erase the Jochi problem. It amplified it. Batu was now the heir to this deeply distrusted branch of the family. He inherited not only his father's vast Ulus, but also his father's reputation for disloyalty. His uncles, who already despised his bloodline, now had a political reason to fear him as the son of a potential traitor. Batu was still reeling from this, trying to consolidate his power over his father's lands, when the second earth-shattering blow fell. Just a few months later, in August of 1227, Genghis Khan himself died. The unshakable Khan, the world conqueror, the man who was more a force of nature than a person, was gone. The founder of the nation, the living embodiment of the Yassa, the center of their universe, had died. A profound shock must have rippled across the continent, from the shores of the Caspian Sea to the coast of China. For Batu, this was a moment of supreme crisis and perhaps dark opportunity. The man who may have ordered his father's death was gone. But so was the empire's great protector and final arbiter. The world was now leaderless. According to Mongol law and the Yassa, when the great Khan died, all conquests stopped. All princes of the blood, all the noyans or generals, no matter where they were in the world, had to stop what they were doing and return to the Mongol heartland. They had to gather for a great Kurultai, the assembly that would elect the new great Khan. This was the law. Genghis Khan's youngest son, Talyui, Batu's uncle, took over as regent, a temporary caretaker of the empire, as was the tradition. Batu was now in the most precarious position of his life. He was the new head of the Jochid Ulus, but he was young, untested in a major war. His father had died in disgrace, and his powerful uncles, Subutai, the legalist who hated him, Ogdi, the designated heir, and Talyui, the regent, now held all the cards. Batu had to navigate this political minefield. He was no longer just a prince. He was a ruler. He was responsible for his father's legacy, his lands, and his many brothers. And his first challenge was not a foreign enemy, but his own family. He had to secure his inheritance not just from his uncles, but from his own blood. He had to prove that he, Batu, was the true master of Jochi's house, a house that included nearly 40 sons. The death of Jochi left a massive power vacuum, and the Ulus of Jochi was not a simple inheritance. It was a sprawling, half-conquered territory filled with countless warriors, and Jochi himself had left behind a huge family. By some counts, nearly 40 sons. According to the Yassa and Mongol tradition, the leadership should have passed to Jochi's eldest son, Ordorichin. Batu was the second son. This was, on paper, an unshakable law. Orda was the rightful heir. And in any other Mongol lineage, this would have been the start of a bloody civil war between the brothers. Their uncles, Subutai and Ogdi, were likely watching from the heartland, expecting and perhaps hoping for exactly this. If the sons of Jochi fell to fighting each other, it would be the perfect excuse for the great Khan to intervene. He could declare them incompetent, a danger to the empire. He could use his authority to break up their powerful Ulus, divide its armies, and scatter its lands among his own sons. The entire legacy of Jochi, the guest, would be erased in a single generation. The sons of Jochi knew this, and they knew, perhaps better than anyone, the depth of the hostility they faced from the rest of the Golden family. They were the outsiders. They were the tainted line. Their survival depended on one thing: absolute, unbreakable unity. This was Batu's first and most important test. It was not a test of war, but of politics. The eldest brother, Orda, was a respected man. He was known to be thoughtful, pious, and perhaps more spiritually inclined than his younger brother. He was a capable warrior, but he may not have had the stomach for the kind of brutal, cold-blooded politics that would be required to survive his uncles. Batu, on the other hand, was his name. He was the rock. He was cold, he was calculating, and he was filled with the same burning, validating ambition that had defined his entire life. He was the only one who seemed to have the iron will to stare down his uncle Subutai and not blink. What happened next was not a conquest. It was a strategic decision of profound importance. The senior sons of Jochi held their own Kurultai, their own family assembly. Orderichen looked at the political landscape, he looked at his younger brother, and he made a choice that would secure his family's future. He voluntarily stepped aside. He ceded his birthright, his position as the leader of the Ulus, to his younger brother, Batu. This was not an act of weakness. It was an act of incredible strategic wisdom. Orda recognized that while he was the eldest, Batu was the champion their family needed. He was the fist they could raise against their rivals. Orda's support gave Batu something crucial: legitimacy. He was not a usurper. He was the chosen leader, backed by the rightful heir. This wasn't a total abdication. The Ulus of Jochi was now reorganized. Orda would take the eastern wing of his father's lands, an area that would become known as the White Horde. Batu would rule the western wing, the Blue Horde. But there was no question who was in charge. Batu was the Khan, the senior ruler. Orda was his loyal vassal, his first and most powerful ally. With Orda's loyalty secured, Batu moved to consolidate his power further. He turned to his other capable brothers, especially a younger, fiercer one named Brink. Brink was a brilliant and aggressive military commander. Batu did not see him as a rival, but as an asset. He brought Brink into his inner circle, gave him command, and earned his unshakable loyalty. So when the call came for the Great Kurultai in 1229 to finally elect the new Great Khan, Batu did not ride to the Mongol heartland as a young, frightened prince, hoping to be confirmed in his inheritance. He arrived as the undisputed master of the Jochid line. He arrived at the head of a unified Ulus, with his brothers Orda and Brink riding beside him, not as rivals, but as his loyal commanders. He controlled his father's vast armies, and he spoke as one unified voice. His uncles, Subutai and Ogdi, must have been stunned. The Jochi problem had not fragmented and disappeared. It had consolidated. It had become stronger. Batu had passed his first test. He had proven he was a master politician. He was now a major power player in the empire, and he was about to get his first taste of a real imperial war, one that would teach him the skills he would later use to devastate the West. The Great Kurultai of 1229 was a sea of white felt, the traditional color of the Mongol nobility, a gathering of the most powerful men on the planet. Batu arrived at the head of his unified family, a new and serious power player. The air was thick with tension. His powerful uncles were all there. Subutai, the unyielding guardian of the law. Talyui, the regent, who held the empire in his hands for 2 years and commanded its largest armies. And Ogdi, the third son, whom Genghis Khan himself had designated as his heir. Batu was a pragmatist. He knew that any attempt to claim the throne for himself, or to support his uncle Talyui, would shatter the empire and violate the Yassa. His path to legitimacy was not through rebellion, but through perfect, calculated loyalty. He threw his full support behind his grandfather's chosen successor, Ogdi. With the combined backing of Batu and Talyui, Ogdi's election was secured. He was formally raised on the traditional felt carpet and proclaimed the second great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Ogdi was a very different man from his father. He was known to be generous, a great drinker, and a builder. His first act as Khan was to reward his family's loyalty and establish order. He looked to his nephew, Batu, the cold, disciplined young man who had so dutifully supported him, and he formally confirmed Batu's authority. Batu was now, by the decree of the great Khan, the undisputed ruler of his father's domain. But what was this domain? What was the inheritance that Jochi had left him? The Mongol word for it was Ulus. This word is crucial. An Ulus is not a kingdom in the way a European king would understand it. A European king inherited land, a piece of territory with defined borders, cities, and farms. The land was the prize. The Mongol system was different. An Ulus did not mean land. It meant people or nation. When Genghis Khan divided the world, he did not give his sons parcels of earth. He gave them populations. He gave each son a grant of a certain number of nomadic families, their herds, and their warriors. And more importantly, he did not give them borders. He gave them directions. Genghis Khan had pointed his sons at the map of the world. To his second son, Subutai, he gave the lands of Central Asia. His mission was to guard the Yassa and secure the vital Silk Road trade routes. To his youngest son, Talyui, he gave the traditional inheritance, the Mongol heartland itself, the hearth. To Ogdi, he gave the supreme title. And to his first son, Jochi, he had given the most distant, the most challenging, and the most ambitious grant of all. He was given the lands to the west. This inheritance, which now passed to Batu, was defined by a poetic and terrifyingly vague phrase, "As far as the hoof of a Mongol horse is trodden." This was not a gift of a settled, rich kingdom. It was a mission. It was a command. It was a blank check for conquest. His inheritance was everything from the Aral Sea to the setting sun. His Ulus was a right to conquer the unknown. For Batu's uncles, Ogdi and Subutai, this was a perfect solution. It sent the problematic Jochid line, the line of the guest, as far away from the imperial capital as possible. Batu and his formidable brothers would be busy for decades in the unknown, dangerous lands of the West. They would either be killed by the fierce Kipchak tribes and the unknown armies of the Russians, or they would be too occupied to meddle in the politics of the heartland. For Batu, it was the ultimate opportunity. It was, in a way, freedom. He had a stage all his own, far from the judging eyes of his rivals. He had a chance to build his own empire under his own command, all while appearing to be the most loyal of vassals, perfectly fulfilling his grandfather's great mission. This mission would define his life. He was not just a prince. He was the designated conqueror of the West. Batu now had everything he needed. He had the unified loyalty of his brothers and his vast armies. He had the full legal and political backing of the great Khan. He had the ironclad discipline of the Yassa and a personal burning need to prove his worth. He was almost ready, but he still lacked one critical piece of modern Mongol experience. He was a master of the steppe, of cavalry, of the bow, of the nerge. But his grandfather's wars in China and Persia had taught the Mongols a new terrible science: the art of breaking cities. Before Batu could turn his gaze west, his uncle, the new Great Khan Ogdi, had one last task for him. Batu's military education was not quite complete. His first test as an imperial commander would not be against the knights of Europe, but against the fortress cities of northern China. In 1229, Ogdi was the new Great Khan, and Batu was the newly confirmed ruler of the West. But Batu did not immediately ride west. Ogdi had a pressing immediate objective: to finish the war his father had started. This was the final campaign against the Jin dynasty in northern China. This was, at the time, the most formidable kingdom the Mongols had ever faced. It was wealthy, technologically advanced, and defended by massive, thick-walled cities. The Jin had already been fighting the Mongols for 2 decades, and they were experts in defensive warfare. They had powerful crossbows, fiery projectiles, and even a primitive form of gunpowder, which they used in thundering heaven bombs to terrify Mongol horses. To finally break them, Ogdi called for a massive empire-wide effort. He would lead one army, his brother Talyui would lead another, and he summoned his nephews, the new generation of princes, to join them and prove their worth. For Batu, this was a crucial summons. It was his first major imperial campaign. It was his chance to fight alongside his powerful uncles, not as a rival, but as a loyal commander. It was his opportunity to publicly wash away the shadow of his father's perceived treason with his own unquestionable service to the Great Khan. He led his own 2 mon of warriors east, not west, to join the Grand Army. This campaign, which lasted from 1230 to 1234, was Batu's University of War. Batu was already a master of the steppe. He understood open-field cavalry tactics, the nurge, the ambush, and the horse archer. But the Jin campaign was not a war of open fields. It was a brutal, grinding war of sieges. The first generation of Mongols under Genghis Khan had learned this the hard way. When they first encountered city walls, they were baffled. Their only tactic was to ride around the walls, shooting arrows, or to pile up captured peasants and try to climb over their bodies. But the Mongol genius was not just in conquering. It was in adapting. As they conquered northern China and Persia, Genghis Khan's armies did something revolutionary. When they took a city, they would sort the population. Artisans and craftsmen were usually spared. And most importantly, military engineers, the men who knew how to build and operate siege engines, were treated like priceless treasures. They were not killed. They were recruited. The Mongols formed an entire corps of captive engineers, thousands strong. They were attached to the army and brought to every new battle. This is what Batu witnessed and mastered in China. He wasn't just a cavalry commander. He was a student of this new, terrifying science. He learned that a wall was not an obstacle. It was a problem to be solved with engineering. He learned how to use a traction trebuchet, a smaller catapult, powered by a team of men pulling on ropes. It couldn't break a wall, but it could fire rapidly, launching a constant, terrifying barrage of stones and firepots over the walls to clear the ramparts of defenders. More importantly, he learned to use the counterweight trebuchet. This was the heavy artillery of the Middle Ages, a giant machine, often built on site from local timber. It used a massive multi-ton counterweight to swing a beam that could hurl boulders weighing hundreds of pounds. These were the wall smashers. Batu learned that a siege was not just a battle. It was a psychological operation. The Mongols would bring these machines up and begin a relentless 24-hour bombardment. The thud, thud, thud of the stones day and night was designed to break the enemy's will long before the wall itself broke. He learned other tricks too. He learned how to divert rivers to flood a city's defenses. He learned how to build vast earthen ramps, protected by giant shields, right up to the top of a city's walls. He learned how to use captured populations as human shields, forcing them to push siege towers or fill in moats, saving his own valuable Mongol troops. And he learned about gunpowder. He saw the fire lances of the Jin defenders and the devastating effect of their exploding bombs. And when those cities fell, the Mongols captured those weapons and the men who made them. The campaign was a brutal success. In 1234, the Jin dynasty was utterly destroyed. The great Khan Ogdi was victorious. Batu returned to his Ulus a changed man. He was no longer just a steppe warrior. He was a complete general. He had proven his loyalty to Ogdi beyond all question. He had earned his battlefield credentials in the eyes of the entire empire. And, most critically, he now understood exactly how to conquer the West. He knew that Russia and Europe were not just open plains. They were lands of wooden forts, called Kremlins, and stone castles. His old tactics would not be enough. But now he had the key. He knew that when he finally rode west, he would not be riding only with horsemen. He would be bringing his new deadly corps of Chinese and Persian engineers. He would bring the wall smashers. His education was finally complete. When Batu returned from the ashes of the Jin dynasty, he was a different man. He had left his Ulus as a prince haunted by his father's shadow. He returned as a victorious imperial general, a master of siege warfare, and a commander who had earned the respect of the entire Mongol military machine. He had proven his loyalty to the great Khan Ogdi. His education was complete. He returned to an empire at the absolute peak of its power and confidence. Under Ogdi, the Mongol world was experiencing a brief golden age. Ogdi had begun building a magnificent imperial capital, Karakorum, a permanent city in the steppe. He was famously generous, lavishly spending the treasures of China and Persia, hosting enormous feasts and drinking heavily. The empire was rich, unified, and secure. And so, in the spring of 1235, Ogdi called a great Kurultai. This was not a somber meeting to choose a new leader, like the one in 1229. This was a celebration of victory and a planning session for the future. The princes and generals gathered from every corner of the empire to feast, drink, and most importantly, decide where the great Mongol war machine would strike next. Ogdi, in his generosity and ambition, did not just want one war. He wanted to fulfill his father's destiny and conquer the entire world, all at once. The Kurultai of 1235 was arguably the most ambitious war council in human history. They decided to launch new invasions in 3 directions simultaneously. First, an army would move east to finally subdue the stubborn kingdom of Korea on its peninsula. Second, a massive new army would be raised to begin the most difficult war the Mongols would ever fight: the conquest of the southern Song dynasty in China. This was a rich, technologically advanced empire of 60 million people, defended by vast rivers, mountains, and a powerful navy. But the third, and for our story the most important decision, was the Great Western March. The time had come. Batu's Ulus, the right to conquer the West, would finally be activated. The Kurultai formally approved a massive all-empire campaign to fulfill Genghis Khan's original command: to ride to the ultimate sea, the Atlantic Ocean. The first targets were clear: the Kipchak tribes of the steppe, the Bulgars on the Volga River, and the wealthy disunited Russian principalities just beyond them. This was not to be a jocketed campaign. It was not Batu's private war. Ogdi declared this a pan-Mongol enterprise. It was a matter of supreme imperial importance. He commanded that every single branch of the Golden family must contribute troops and, crucially, a senior prince to lead them. This is the moment our story's cast of characters truly assembles. From the line of the great Khan Ogdi himself came his son, Güyük. Güyük was arrogant, proud, and deeply imbued with the sense of superiority his branch of the family felt. He also personally and intensely despised Batu, whom he considered a bastard not fit to command. From the line of Subutai, the family's harsh legalist, came his son, Buri. Buri shared his father's contempt for Jochi's line and was a close friend of Güyük. They were, in essence, a two-man clique of Batu haters. From the line of the youngest son Talyui, the great warrior, came his eldest son, Monk. Monk was different. He was a sober, serious, and highly capable commander. He had fought alongside Batu in China and respected his skill. He was a professional soldier, not a politician, and he would become one of Batu's few allies. And finally, from the line of Jochi, came Batu himself, along with his loyal brothers, the pious Orda and the fierce Burke. This gathering of princes created a major political problem. Who would lead? Who would be in overall command? The army was a volatile cocktail of ambitious, jealous, and powerful cousins, each a king in his own right. Ogdi made his decision. The supreme commander of the Great Western March would be Batu Khan. On the surface, this was the only logical legal choice. According to the Yassa, the lands they were about to conquer were officially part of the Ulus of Jochi. This was Batu's assigned territory. He was, in effect, the host of the invasion. But underneath this legal reason was Ogdi's brilliant, hidden political motive. Ogdi was not a fool. He saw these young princes, Batu, Güyük, Monk. They were like young wolves, full of ambition and energy. If they were allowed to stay in the capital, Karakorum, what would they do? They would feast, they would drink, and they would plot against each other. And eventually they would plot against him. Ogdi's solution was a masterstroke. He sent all of them, all his ambitious nephews and his own arrogant son, on the largest, longest, and most dangerous campaign in Mongol history. He was literally sending his rivals to the other side of the world. They would be too busy fighting Russians and Hungarians to cause trouble at home. They would expend all their restless, violent energy on external enemies. And if they were successful, they would enrich the empire. If they failed, or even if some of them were killed, well, that too would solve Ogdi's political problems. But Ogdi also knew this Council of Princes was a dysfunctional command. They would bicker and argue. He needed one more element. He needed a professional. He appointed the man who was, by then, the greatest and most experienced general in the world, Subutai. Subutai was one of Genghis Khan's original dogs of war. He was a living legend, a man who had commanded armies from Korea to the plains of Russia. He was the strategic genius behind the war against the Khwarezmian Empire. He had already been to Russia in his famous 1223 raid. He knew the terrain, he knew the enemy. Subutai was given the real military command. Batu was the political head, the chairman of the board. But Subutai was the CEO, the man who would draw up the battle plans. He was the grizzled, respected veteran who could, hopefully, keep the arrogant young princes in line. The stage was now set. In 1236, the call went out. From all across the empire, two Muns began to move. The greatest army the Mongols had ever assembled began its slow westward march. It was a nation in motion, and at its head rode Batu Khan, a man who was finally about to fulfill his mission and prove his worth. The army that marched west in 1236 was a council of proud, jealous princes. Batu was its political head, the senior authority. But the man who held the army's brain in his hands was someone else entirely. He was not a prince. He was not a member of the Golden family. He was, perhaps, the single greatest general the world has ever produced. His name was Subutai. To understand the invasion of Europe, one must understand Subutai. He was the living embodiment of Genghis Khan's revolution. He was not a noble. He was a man of the forest, born the son of a simple blacksmith. In any other society on earth at that time, he would have lived and died as a blacksmith. But in the meritocratic new world of Genghis Khan, talent was everything. He had joined Temujin as a teenager and quickly proved himself. He was not a flashy duelist. He was a master of the hunt, a man who thought in terms of maps, logistics, and vast distances. He became one of Genghis Khan's four hounds, or dogs of war, his most trusted, most relentless, and most brilliant field commanders. He was not royalty. He was a professional. By 1235, Subutai was in his late 50s or early 60s, an old man by Mongol standards. But he was at the peak of his strategic genius. He was the man who had helped mastermind the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire. He had led campaigns from the frozen forests of Siberia to the mountains of Georgia. And most importantly, Subutai already knew the enemy. For him, this was not a new war. It was the resumption of a campaign he had personally begun more than a decade earlier. In 1221, after the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire, Subutai and another general Jib were given a small army. Just two Tumans or 20,000 men. Their mission was a reconnaissance in force. They were to chase the fugitive Khwarezmian Shah and just keep going. What followed was the single most extraordinary cavalry campaign in history. Subutai and Jib led their 20,000 men on a 3-year, 5,500-mile circular raid that has no parallel. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains in the dead of winter, a feat most thought impossible. They burst into the lands of the Kipchak tribes, shattering them. And then they entered the lands of the Rus. The disunited Russian princes saw these new invaders as just another band of steppe raiders. They formed a large, sloppy confederation of armies and marched out to meet them. At the Kalka River in 1223, Subutai gave them their first bloody lesson in Mongol warfare. He used the classic Mongol tactic, the feigned retreat. For 9 days, the Mongols pretended to be a terrified, beaten rabble, running for their lives. The overconfident Rus princes broke formation, chasing them in a mad dash for glory. On the 9th day, Subutai sprung his trap. His fleeing army turned, reformed, and fresh reserve units appeared on the flanks. The Rus army, exhausted and disorganized, was encircled and annihilated. It was a massacre. Subutai did not stay. He had not come to conquer. Yet, he had come to learn. After the battle, he captured several Russian princes. He had them bound and, in a famously brutal act, laid them on the ground. He then built a heavy wooden platform on top of them, and he and his officers held a victory feast on that platform, slowly crushing the princes to death as they ate. This was not just cruelty. It was a message. It was a ritual execution of enemy leaders. For 12 years, Subutai had been waiting to return. He was now back. And he was not a raider. He was the chief strategist of the largest army the empire had ever sent west. His philosophy of war was revolutionary. European and Rus generals thought in terms of single, decisive battles. Subutai thought in terms of campaigns. He was a master of intelligence. He spent months, sometimes years, gathering information. He sent spies, disguised as merchants or envoys, deep into enemy territory. He mapped their roads, their rivers, their political divisions. He knew, for example, that the Rus princes hated each other. He knew their rivalries. He knew who was allied with whom. He planned to use this disunity as his primary weapon. He was also a master of the multi-pronged attack. He never sent his army in one single, lumbering column. He moved his Tumans in multiple parallel columns, often separated by hundreds of miles. They were a net, not a spear. This had several advantages. It allowed the vast army to graze and feed itself without stripping the land bare. It confused the enemy. They would hear reports of Mongols in the east, only to be attacked from the north. And it allowed Subutai to encircle and destroy entire armies and nations. His mind was a continental chessboard. Now, at the Kurultai, he was paired with Batu. It was a perfect match. Batu was the rock, the unyielding political authority, the chairman. He was the grandson of Genghis Khan, the only man who could legally command the other jealous princes, Güyük and Buri. He was the center of gravity. Subutai was the CEO, the professional who did not care for politics. He was loyal to the mission. His presence ensured that this would not be a clumsy war led by arrogant young nobles. It would be a symphony of destruction, planned and executed by the greatest military mind of the age. Batu would keep the princes in line. Subutai would tell them where to march. Batu was the political authority. Subutai was the strategic brain. But the instrument they wielded was the most advanced, disciplined, and terrifying military organization on planet Earth. When we think of the Mongol army, the word that often comes to mind is horde. This word suggests chaos, a seething, disorganized mass of barbarians. The reality was the exact opposite. The Mongol army was a machine of cold, mathematical precision. It was a professional, meritocratic, and unified force whose structure and tactics were generations ahead of any other army in the world. Its design was simple but revolutionary. As we touched on, Genghis Khan had abolished the old, fragile tribal loyalties. The army was not a collection of allied tribes who might flee if their chieftain was killed. It was a single, unified body, organized on the decimal system. The largest unit was the Tumen, a division of 10,000 men. This was divided into minghans, or regiments of 1,000. These were divided into jagans, or companies of 100. And these were divided into the most important unit of all, the Arban, the squad of 10. This Arban was the soldier's new family. The 10 men in that unit lived, marched, hunted, and fought together. They were bound by the Yassa in a pact of life and death. If one man was captured, the other 9 had to rescue him. If one man fled, all 10 were executed. This system created a level of small unit cohesion and discipline that no feudal European army, a collection of knights loyal only to their own lord, could ever hope to match. Your old tribe, your old family name meant nothing. Your Arban was everything. This army was composed almost entirely of cavalry, giving it a level of strategic mobility that was baffling to its enemies. But it was not just one kind of horseman. It was a combined arms force of light and heavy cavalry that worked in perfect synchronization. The vast majority of the army was light cavalry. These were the Mangadai, the classic horse archers. Their armor was speed. They carried the composite bow, a quiver of specialized arrows, some for piercing armor, others for whistling to signal, a small sword or axe, and a coil of rope. They rode the small, tough, and incredibly resilient Mongol horses. Their job was to be the eyes, the ears, and the tormentors of the army. They would scout, screen, harass, provoke, and herd the enemy into a killing ground. Then came the fist, the heavy cavalry. These were the shock troops, a smaller but decisive part of the army. They wore heavier lamellar armor, made of overlapping plates of leather or iron, stitched together. Their horses were often armored as well. These warriors carried the composite bow, but their primary weapon for the charge was a long 12-foot lance, often fitted with a wicked-looking hook at its base. This hook was a simple, brutal invention designed specifically to defeat armored knights. The Mongol lancer could use it to physically snag a knight and pull him off his horse, where he would be helpless on the ground, left for the light cavalry to dispatch. And a little-known fact: many warriors wore a simple silk shirt under their armor. This was not for comfort. It was practical battlefield medicine. If a barbed arrow struck the warrior, it would pierce the armor, but the silk shirt would often not tear. It would wrap itself around the arrowhead as it entered the wound. This allowed a surgeon to pull the arrow out gently by tugging on the silk, minimizing tissue damage and infection. This perfectly structured army used a doctrine that was, again, revolutionary. A European knight's goal was to prove his personal courage, to find his equal and defeat him in a glorious charge. The Mongol doctrine was the opposite. A warrior's goal was not to fight fairly. It was not to prove his courage. It was to win. It was to kill the enemy with the least possible risk to himself. Subutai's entire philosophy was to win the battle before it was truly fought, through intelligence, maneuver, and psychology. Their most devastating, most famous tactic, the one that broke armies from China to Poland, was the Taluma, or the feigned retreat. This was not a simple trick. It was a complex, disciplined, and psychologically devastating maneuver. It began with the light cavalry. They would ride up to the enemy line, unleashing a storm of arrows. They would provoke the enemy, taunting them, then suddenly break and pretend to flee in a panic. They would look like a terrified, beaten rabble. This was a psychological trap, and their enemies fell into it almost every time. A European knight, encased in heavy armor, riding a giant warhorse, was trained to believe he was invincible. He was intensely proud. He would see this fleeing rabble and see only one thing: cowardice. He would see a chance for glory. He would order a charge. The heavy knights would surge forward, their formations breaking as the faster knights outpaced the slower ones. The chase would begin. The Mongols were masters of this. They would stay just out of reach, leading the heavy, charging enemy deeper and deeper into territory the Mongols had chosen. The chase might go on for miles. The knights' giant horses, not bred for endurance, would become lathered in sweat and exhausted. Their formations would be completely broken. And then, just when the enemy was tired, disorganized, and far from any hope of reinforcement, the trap would spring. A signal horn would sound. The fleeing Mongols would suddenly, shockingly, turn on a dime. They would reform their lines. At the same moment, fresh, heavy cavalry reserves, hidden in valleys, behind hills, or in forests, would slam into the enemy's flanks. The hunters, in an instant, became the encircled, exhausted prey. It was the Nurj hunt, but the prey was human. The feigned retreat was a devastating tactic, but it was only one tool in the Mongol arsenal. Their true genius was the combination of this battlefield trickery with two other, even more powerful weapons: psychological warfare and siege engineering. The psychological weapon was, in many ways, their most effective. It was simple, binary, and ruthlessly clear. Surrender or die. This was not a bluff. It was a formal legal policy, delivered by Mongol envoys before a battle or siege began. If a city, a prince, or a nation surrendered to the Khan's authority upon first asking, they would be spared. They would be incorporated into the Mongol Empire. Their soldiers would be folded into the Mongol army. They would have to pay a tax, the tribute, but their lives, their property, and their religions would be protected. But if they resisted, if they killed the envoys, or if they fought back and lost, then the Yassa was clear: they had forfeited their right to exist. When a city that resisted was finally taken, the Mongols would conduct a terrifyingly methodical sorting. The engineers, the craftsmen, the artisans, all the useful people, were rounded up and enslaved for the good of the empire. The young women and children were divided among the soldiers as property. All other men who had carried a weapon, and often the entire remaining population, were marched out of the city gates and methodically, cold-bloodedly executed. This wasn't a berserker rage. It was a calculated act of state policy. It was terror used as a weapon. The Mongols understood that the cheapest victory was the one you never had to fight. They wanted stories of their brutality to spread. They would often intentionally let a few survivors escape a massacre. These terrified, traumatized people would flee to the next city. And what would they tell the people there? They wouldn't just say they were defeated. They would say, "This is not an army, this is the wrath of God. They are unstoppable. They show no mercy. We are all going to die." By the time the Mongol vanguard arrived at the gates of the next city, half the battle was already won. The city's will to fight was already broken. This policy of calculated terror was what allowed them to conquer nations with a speed that defied logic. The second part of this equation was their intelligence network. Subutai and Batu did not ride blind into the west. For years, Subutai's agents had been fanning out across the steppe. These spies, disguised as merchants or diplomats, had mapped the lands of the Rus. They gathered vital data. They knew about the great rivers, the Volga and the Dnieper. They knew when those rivers froze, and crucially, they learned that the frozen rivers in winter became perfect, flat highways for their heavy cavalry and siege engines. They also learned the most important fact of all. The Rus principalities were not a unified nation. They were a squabbling collection of rival city-states and princes. The Prince of Ryazan hated the Prince of Vladimir. The Prince of Vladimir was wary of Kiev. The great northern city of Novgorod was a merchant republic that stood apart from them all. Subutai and Batu knew they would not be facing Russia. They would be facing a dozen small, arrogant kingdoms, one at a time. And this brought them to their final weapon. The one Batu had personally mastered in China. The engineering corps. The Russian principalities were lands of forests and forts. Their main defense was the Kremlin, a wooden fortress, usually built on a hill, with thick ramparts made of earth and timber. To a European army, these were formidable obstacles. To Batu's army, they were firewood. The Rus and the European knights knew how to build a simple catapult, a mangonel or a torsion engine powered by twisted ropes. These were inaccurate and not very powerful. They had never seen what Batu was bringing. When the Mongol army arrived at a city, the defenders would look down from their walls and see, not an immediate chaotic charge, but a slow, terrifyingly organized operation. The Mongol army would form a loose blockade. Thousands of men would be sent into the surrounding forests to cut timber. The captive engineers, Chinese, Persian, Khwarezmian, would begin their work. Then the Rus defenders would see them. The giant counterweight trebuchets. The wall smashers. These machines, which the Rus had no answer for, would be assembled just out of arrow range. And then the bombardment would begin. It was relentless. Day and night. Thud, thud, thud. Giant stones, weighing hundreds of pounds, smashing into the same section of the wooden wall over and over. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. And they didn't just hurl stones. They would launch pots of flaming naphtha, a kind of primitive petroleum, turning wooden forts into infernos. In a horrifying act of biological and psychological warfare, they would use the trebuchets to hurl diseased animal carcasses, or even the bodies of executed prisoners, over the walls, spreading terror and plague within the besieged city. This was the army that Batu and Subutai led west in 1236. It was not a horde. It was a perfectly structured, mobile, combined arms force. It was led by a genius strategist and a ruthlessly ambitious politician. It used disciplined battlefield tactics that no enemy understood. It used a sophisticated global intelligence network. It used psychological terror as a primary weapon. And it brought a corps of siege engineers that was, for all intents and purposes, a 13th century artillery division. They were about to be unleashed on a world that still believed warfare was about the glorious, chivalrous charge of a few hundred knights. The collision would not be a war. It would be an apocalypse. This apocalyptic war machine, having gathered its full strength in the steppes north of the Caspian Sea, began to move in the late summer and autumn of 1236. This army, numbering perhaps over 100,000 of the best soldiers on earth, was now pointed at the heart of Europe. But its first objective was not the lands of the Rus. It was the rich, settled kingdom that controlled the great Volga River. Volga, Bulgaria. To a modern Western audience, this is an unfamiliar name. But in the 13th century, Volga, Bulgaria was a major regional power. It was not a kingdom of steppe nomads. It was an advanced, urbanized civilization. It was a wealthy northern Islamic state that had converted centuries earlier. Its people were skilled farmers, fur traders, and merchants. This kingdom was the gatekeeper. It sat on the crucial junction of the Volga and Kama rivers, controlling the trade routes that connected Scandinavia and the Ruslands with the Silk Road and the Middle East. Its capital, Byler, was a massive, sprawling city of wood and stone, a major center of learning and commerce that, at its peak, was said to be larger than contemporary London or Paris. The Bulgars were not naive. They were not ignorant of the Mongol threat. In fact, they were dangerously overconfident. They had met the Mongols before. In 1223, after Subutai and Geb had annihilated the Russian princes at the Kalka River, they began their long ride home. On their way, a Bulgar army managed to draw a weary, overextended Mongol column into an ambush near the Samara Bend. It was a small, tactical victory. The Mongols were forced to retreat. But the propaganda value for the Bulgars was immense. They were, perhaps, the only nation in the world that could legitimately claim to have defeated a Mongol army in battle. They had spent the last decade believing they knew how to beat the Tatars. They expected another raid. They expected steppe warriors. They had no idea what was actually coming. This time, it was not a 20,000-man raiding party that was exhausted from a 3-year campaign. It was the full, fresh imperial army, led by Batu and the royal princes, and commanded by the mind of Subutai. Subutai, a master of the multi-pronged attack, did not give the Bulgars a single target to focus on. The army split. Subutai led one force against their northern towns. Another commander, the son of Genghis Khan's brother, attacked from the south. Batu himself, along with the other princes like Güyük and Monk, led the central crushing blow. The Bulgars fought with courage. Their armies met the Mongols in the open field, and they were slaughtered. The feigned retreat, the devastating arrow storms, the shock of the heavy lancers, the Bulgars had no answer for it. But they still believed they were safe. Their true strength lay in their cities. They retreated behind the thick earthen timber walls of Byler, Suvar, and their other fortresses. They prepared for a long conventional siege, a war of attrition they believed the nomads could not win. They were prepared for a steppe war. They were not prepared for what Batu had learned in China. When the Mongol army arrived at the walls of Byler in the autumn of 1236, they did not just shoot arrows. They brought the engineers. For the first time in Europe, this new terrible form of warfare was unveiled. The defenders on the walls watched in horror as the Mongols, with terrifying speed and organization, began constructing the great counterweight trebuchets, the wall smashers. The siege was short and horrific. The giant machines, which the Bulgars had never seen and could not counter, began their 24-hour bombardment. They smashed the city's defenses to splinters. The Mongols used their fire lances and flaming projectiles, turning the wooden city into an inferno. When the walls were breached, the Mongol heavy cavalry stormed the city. The population was subjected to the classic brutal Mongol policy: submit or die. They had resisted. The city was systematically, methodically erased. Its population was massacred or enslaved. The survivors were scattered. The city of Byler, the great city, was so thoroughly destroyed that it was never rebuilt. It vanishes from history. The campaign was over in a matter of months. By the winter of 1236, the kingdom of Volga Bulgaria had ceased to exist. This victory was a terrifying success, and it was strategically brilliant. It served three distinct purposes. First, it was a shakedown. It was the first time this volatile multi-prince army had worked together. It was a live-fire exercise that forged them into a single unit under Batu's and Subutai's command. Second, it eliminated a powerful, wealthy enemy in their rear. When they advanced into Russia, Batu and Subutai would not have to worry about a Bulgar army attacking their supply lines from the east. And third, it gave them complete control of the Volga River, which, as their spies knew, would soon freeze. It would become their main highway, a flat, frozen superhighway leading them directly to their next target. With the Bulgar kingdom shattered and smoldering behind them, the Mongol army had a secure staging ground. They spent the remainder of the winter of 1236 to 1237 resting their horses, gathering intelligence, and preparing. Their spies fanned out into the great forests to the west. Subutai's gaze turned to the collection of wealthy, arrogant, and divided principalities just beyond that forest, the land of the Rus. The Mongol army spent most of 1237 resting, reorganizing, and absorbing the survivors and spoils from Volga Bulgaria. Subutai's spies, who had been operating in the Rus lands for years, now delivered their final reports. The strategic picture was clear, and it was perfect. The land they were about to invade was not a unified kingdom. It was not an empire in any sense of the word. The state known as the Kievan Rus, a once mighty federation of cities held together by a single dynasty and the river trade routes, was, by 1237, a fragmented, dysfunctional, and dying entity. It was a civilization in a state of feudal fragmentation. Power was not centralized. It was scattered among more than a dozen principalities, each ruled by a prince from the same extended Rurikid dynasty. And these princes, who were all cousins, uncles, and nephews, were engaged in constant, petty, and bitter civil wars against each other. They fought over seniority, over prime trading posts, and over the most prestigious thrones. This was the fatal weakness that Subutai's intelligence had identified. The Mongols were not facing one large, dangerous enemy. They were facing a dozen small, arrogant, and self-interested enemies, none of whom would lift a finger to save the other. Subutai and Bata did not even need to divide their enemy. Their enemy was already divided for them. They would simply have to be methodical, isolating each principality and destroying it, one by one. There were three main power blocks in this fragmented world. First, and most prestigious, was the city of Kiev. It was the mother of Rus cities, the ancient symbolic capital. It was the religious heart of the land, home to magnificent golden-domed cathedrals. But its power was fading. It had been sacked and weakened by the Rus princes themselves in earlier civil wars. By 1237, Kiev was more of a grand symbol than a real military power, a prize to be fought over, not a leader to rally around. The second, and at this moment the most powerful principality, was Vladimir Suzdal. This was the new center of power, located in the deep forests of the northeast. Its capital, Vladimir, was a rich and beautiful city. Its ruler, the Grand Prince Yuri Vsevolodovich, was the most powerful man in the Rus lands. He was proud, wealthy, and dangerously confident. And third, sitting on the very edge of the map, bordering the wild steppe, was the Principality of Ryazan. It was a frontier state, a buffer, and because of its location, it was the first one in the Mongols' path. The Rus princes knew about the Mongols. They had not forgotten the Battle of the Kalka River in 1223. But they had learned all the wrong lessons from it. They remembered it as a strange one-time raid by a mysterious steppe tribe that had appeared and then vanished. They did not understand that it was a reconnaissance mission. They did not understand that the defeat was a lesson. They saw the Mongols who had returned, who they called Tatars, as the same raiders they had dealt with for centuries. They believed their wooden walls, their heavy infantry, and their elite Druzina, their armored household knights, could handle them. In the late autumn of 1237, the great Mongol army, having used the frozen rivers as highways, emerged from the forests and entered the lands of Ryazan. Batu's first move was not to attack. It was the classic Mongol move: diplomacy. He sent envoys to the Prince of Ryazan, Yuri Igorevich. The message was the same one they had delivered in China and Bulgaria. It was not a negotiation. It was a bill. The chroniclers record the Mongols' demand as simple and absolute. We want a tithe, a tenth of everything. Of your princes, of your people, of your horses, of your arms. The Prince of Ryazan, faced with this demand, did what a Rus prince always did. He played for time and called for help. He sent messengers to the most powerful prince, Yuri of Vladimir Suzdal, begging him to send his armies and help defend the first line of the Rus lands. The Grand Prince of Vladimir refused. His decision is one of the most infamous in Russian history. He may have been arrogant, believing the raiders would exhaust themselves on Ryazan's walls. He may have been cynical, happy to see a rival principality weakened. He may simply not have understood the scale of the threat. His official reply was that he would defend his own lands when the time came. He would not help Ryazan. The Prince of Ryazan, now completely alone, gave his reply to the Mongol envoys. It was a sentence of famous suicidal pride. "Only when none of us are left," he said, "will all be yours." The envoys were dismissed. The war had begun. For Batu and Subutai, this was perfect. The house was divided. The first prince had refused to bend, and the strongest prince had refused to help him. The Mongol war machine, which had been resting for months, was now unleashed. In December 1237, the full weight of the imperial army, complete with its corps of Chinese engineers, descended upon the capital city of Ryazan. The first piece on Subutai's chessboard was about to be swept from the board. The Prince of Ryazan's proud words, "Only when none of us are left will all be yours," were a death sentence for his city. The Mongol war machine, a professional army of 100,000, now focused its entire terrible power on this one isolated principality. In December 1237, the great army arrived at the walls of Ryazan. The city was a strong wooden fortress, typical of the Rus lands. Its people were brave, and they fully expected to wait out a long, clumsy siege. They had no idea what Batu had brought from China. The defenders on the walls watched in disbelief. The Mongols did not make a suicidal charge. Instead, their corps of engineers calmly began to assemble the giant counterweight trebuchets, the wall smashers that the Rus had never seen. For 5 days, the bombardment was relentless. The giant machines hurled boulders and flaming pots of naphtha into the city, day and night. The wooden walls, designed to stop men with ladders, were systematically smashed into splinters. On the 6th day, the Mongols stormed the breaches. The battle was a massacre. The city was subjected to the cold, hard logic of the Yassa. It had resisted. It had to be made an example of. The prince was killed. The population was sorted. Artisans were enslaved. The rest were methodically put to the sword. The city of Ryazan was burned so completely that it ceased to exist. The city that bears its name today is a different town, moved to a safer location decades later. The original site was left to the wolves. A famous legend born from this horror tells of a Ryazan boyar, or noble, named Evbedi Kalavrat. He was away on a diplomatic mission and returned to find only ashes and corpses. Driven by a grief-stricken rage, he gathered a small personal retinue of perhaps 1,700 men and set off in pursuit of the main Mongol army. He caught up with their rear guard and attacked with such suicidal fury that he carved a bloody path through them. The Mongol chronicles themselves note this, baffled by the giants of Ryazan who fought with such desperation. He was no strategic threat, but he was a terrible nuisance. The Mongols were forced to use their heavy siege catapults, their stone throwers, against this one small band of cavalry. According to the legend, Kalavrat was finally killed. Batu, marveling at his courage, returned his body to the survivors and allowed them to go free. With Ryazan destroyed, the road was open to the heart of the Rus lands, the powerful principality of Vladimir Suzdal. The Grand Prince Yuri, who had refused to help Ryazan, was now in a panic. He sent out his main army to block the Mongols at a border fortress called Kolomna. He himself, in a fatal decision, did not lead his army. He instead rode north to the banks of the Sit River to try and raise a second army. In January 1238, the Mongols met the main army of Vladimir Suzdal at Kolomna. This was the first, and really the only major open-field battle of the invasion. The Rus army was large, brave, and clad in heavy armor. They were confident they could crush the raiders. The battle was a clinical, brutal demonstration of Mongol tactics. The Rus charged. The Mangadai light cavalry peppered them with arrows and began their classic feigned retreat. The Rus army, arrogant and undisciplined, broke formation and charged after them. And then the trap sprung. Subutai's hidden reserves of heavy cavalry smashed into their flanks, encircling and annihilating the entire army. But the victory came at a high cost. In the chaotic fighting, a prince of the Golden family was killed. It was Kulkan, one of Genghis Khan's own sons from a lesser wife. He was the only direct descendant of Genghis Khan to die in the entire European campaign. The Mongols were victorious, but they were enraged. Their blood price for a son of the Khan would be unimaginably high. Now, no field army stood between Batu and the capital. On their march, they brushed aside a small, insignificant wooden fort, burning it in 5 days and killing the local prince, another son of Yuri. This minor fort was named Moscow. It was a footnote. In February 1238, Batu and Subutai arrived at the gates of Vladimir, the beautiful, wealthy capital. The Grand Prince Yuri was still gone. He had left his wife, his sons, and the bishop to defend the city. The siege was a repeat of Ryazan, but faster and fueled by rage. The trebuchets were assembled. The walls were breached. The city fell in just a few days. The final horror occurred at the city's main stone cathedral. The royal family and hundreds of citizens, seeking sanctuary, locked themselves inside. The Mongols, who had no concept of sanctuary and were furious over the death of Kulkan, showed no mercy. They piled wood around the stone walls of the cathedral and set it on fire. Everyone inside was burned alive. But Subutai was not finished. He was a strategic genius. He knew that destroying the capital was not enough, as long as the leader, Grand Prince Yuri, was still alive and raising a new army. While the main army was still sacking Vladimir, Subutai took a separate force, a full 2 months under his best general, Burundai, and sent it on a covert high-speed march north. Through the deep snows and dense winter forests, Burundai's army moved like ghosts. They bypassed Rus patrols and, in March 1238, they found Yuri's new disorganized army camped on the banks of the Sit River. It was not a battle. It was a complete surprise. The Mongols encircled the camp and fell upon the unprepared army. It was a massacre. Grand Prince Yuri was killed in the chaos. His headless body was found later on the frozen river. In 3 short winter months, Batu and Subutai had completely and utterly destroyed the most powerful principality in Rus. Its first army was annihilated at Kolomna. Its capital was in ashes. Its royal family was dead. Its second army was slaughtered at the Sit River. And its grand prince was headless. The heart of the Rus lands was broken. After the Battle of the Sit River, northeastern Rus was a smoldering, leaderless ruin. In 3 months of a brutal winter campaign, Batu and Subutai had executed a perfect, terrifying war. The Rus armies were annihilated. Their cities were ashes. Their grand prince was dead. No organized military force remained to oppose the Mongols. And one great prize remained untouched: the city of Lord Great Novgorod. Novgorod was not like the other principalities. It was a proud, fiercely independent, and fabulously wealthy merchant republic. It was the eastern hub of the Hanseatic League, the fur capital of Europe. Its merchants traded from Flanders and Scandinavia all the way to Persia. It was a vast, sprawling city, protected not by a prince, but by a powerful militia, and more importantly, by its geography. It was surrounded by dense forests and impassable swamps. The Mongol army, fresh from its victory at the Sit River, turned northwest and began the march on Novgorod. This was the final, logical target. In early March 1238, they reached the fortress of Torzhok, a key trading post known as the Key to Novgorod. The people of Torzhok, knowing the army of Vladimir was gone, resisted with the courage of despair. For 2 full weeks, this one city held off the Mongol army, a much longer and bloodier siege than Batu had expected. But Torzhok finally fell. It was stormed and, in the usual Mongol fashion, erased. The road to Novgorod was now wide open. The Mongol vanguard pushed on. In Novgorod itself, panic reigned. The city was preparing for a hopeless final stand. And then the Mongols stopped. They were at a place called Ignak Cross, a mere 100 kilometers, about 60 miles, from the walls of the great city. They were within striking distance of the richest prize in all of Rus. And Batu and Subutai gave the order to turn back. This is one of the great what-ifs of history. Why did they stop? Why was Novgorod, alone of all the great Rus cities, spared? The true reason was a combination of 3 critical factors, and it demonstrates Subutai's cold, pragmatic genius. First, and most famously, was the Rasputitsa, the spring thaw. It was now late March. The legendary Sea of Mud had begun. The frozen rivers, which had served as perfect highways for the Mongol cavalry and their heavy siege engines, were beginning to crack and break. The ground was turning into an impassable swamp. For a cavalry army, this was a logistical nightmare. They risked losing their entire artillery corps and bogging down their horses in a land that offered no forage. Second, the army was exhausted. They had been on a brutal, non-stop campaign for nearly 4 months. They had fought a major field battle at Kolomna, where a prince of the blood had died. They had conducted 3 major, difficult sieges: Ryazan, Vladimir, and now the 2-week bloodbath at Torzhok. They had lost men. They had lost horses. Their siege equipment was likely damaged. They were not an infinite horde. They were a weary army that had just broken its teeth on Torzhok. And third, and perhaps most important, was the strategic picture. Subutai's grand mission was not Novgorod. His mission, given by the Great Khan, was to conquer the Kipchak steppes in the south, and then to invade Europe. Novgorod was a distraction. It was a bag of gold at the end of a swamp. Subutai had already achieved his primary goal in the northeast. He had eliminated the military power of the Rus. He had neutralized any threat to his flank for the real invasion. Risking his weary army to capture a swampy city, just as the thaw began, was simply bad strategy. The order was given. The army turned south. Novgorod was saved by its mud. But the retreat was not a single, orderly column. The army fanned out into a wide net, mopping up resistance, plundering as they went, ensuring no town was left unpunished. And it was on this victory lap south that the Mongol army ran into a problem. They came to a small, insignificant town in the forests called Kozelsk. It was a minor fort, part of the Chernihiv principality. It was ruled by a 12-year-old prince. The Mongols expected it to surrender on sight. They sent envoys. The people of Kozelsk held a council. They knew what had happened at Ryazan and Vladimir. They knew surrender meant slavery and obedience. They knew resistance meant certain death. They made a collective decision. Though our prince is young, we will die for him. And here we will accept the crown of martyrdom. They killed the Mongol envoys. For Batu and Subutai, this was a shocking act of defiance from a town they couldn't even find on a map. It was an insult. They brought up their siege engines, the same ones that had taken Vladimir in 5 days, and began the assault. The siege of Kozelsk lasted for 7 weeks. For 7 weeks, this tiny no-name wooden fort held off the entire enraged Mongol imperial army. The Mongols used their trebuchets, but the defenders rebuilt the walls. The defenders launched surprise counterattacks, killing Mongol engineers. Batu, Güyük, and the other princes were humiliated. They were losing thousands of their elite, battle-hardened soldiers, veterans of China and Ryazan, to a collection of hunters and farmers in a wooden fort. The siege was so disastrous that they had to send for reinforcements. The 2 Muns of Khadan and Buri, who were campaigning elsewhere, had to be called in. Finally, after 7 weeks, the combined Mongol force, using all its engineering might, breached the walls. The defenders did not wait to be slaughtered. In a final suicidal act, the last 400 survivors, carrying only knives, threw open the gates and charged the entire Mongol army, dying in a final hopeless attack. The Mongols had won, but at a catastrophic cost. They had lost more men at Kozelsk than they had in any other battle of the Rus campaign. Batu, in a cold fury, ordered the town leveled. He forbade its name from even being spoken. He decreed that it be known only as Novgorod, the evil city, the city that had dared to fight back. By the summer of 1238, the campaign was finally over. The army, battered, exhausted, and having lost its momentum at the evil city, retreated all the way south, back to the open steppes along the Don and Volga rivers. They needed to rest their horses, integrate their new slaves, and wait for reinforcements. The conquest of northeastern Rus was complete, but the south, and the great golden city of Kiev, still lay untouched. The Mongol army that limped away from the evil city of Kozelsk in the summer of 1238 was battered, weary, and in need of a long rest. The great northern campaign was over. The army retreated to the vast open grasslands of the Don and Volga river basins, the heartland of the future Golden Horde. For over a year, the world held its breath. This period is often seen as a simple lull in the fighting, but it was not. It was a strategic consolidation. Batu and Subutai had 2 main objectives. The first was to rest their forces, absorb new recruits, and allow their vast herds of horses to recover and grow. The second was to secure their new homeland. We must remember, the invasion of the Rus principalities was, in many ways, secondary. The primary mission of the Jochid Ulus was to conquer the western steppe, the lands of the Kipchak tribes, also known as the Cumans or Polovtsians. So during 1239, while the Rus cities in the north licked their wounds, Batu's armies waged a systematic, ruthless war against the Kipchak nomads. This was a war they knew how to fight, steppe versus steppe. The Kipchak resistance, led by a Khan named Kodian, was fierce, but it was disorganized. By the end of 1239, the Kipchaks were broken. They were either slaughtered, absorbed into the Mongol army, or fled west. Khan Kodian himself led 40,000 of his people on a desperate migration into the Kingdom of Hungary, seeking asylum. This single act would have dire consequences for Hungary, as it gave Batu a perfect legal pretext to invade them later. While this steppe war was raging, Batu also launched a second wave against southern Rus. These were mop-up operations. Mongol columns under the command of Monk, the serious professional prince, swept through the lands that had been untouched. They sacked the city of Pereyaslav. They marched on Chernihiv, the capital of the prince who had nominally ruled Kozelsk. They brought up their trebuchets, and Chernihiv, one of the largest cities in Rus, fell in a single brutal assault. It was also during this lull that the deep, bitter tensions within the Mongol royal family finally exploded. The arrogant princes, Güyük and Buri, the sons of Ogdi and Subutai, were bored. They had spent a year in the steppes, far from the comforts of the capital. They were forced to take orders from Batu, a man they considered their bastard inferior. At a great victory banquet, fueled by drink, their resentment boiled over. Buri, the grandson of Subutai, slammed his cup down and declared, "Since Batu is no better than a woman with a beard, we should just leave." Güyük, the great Khan's own son, chimed in with his own insults, furious that he had been forced to fight in the humiliating siege of Kozelsk. The argument was a terrible breach of the Yassa. It was treason. Batu, ever the cold politician, did not draw his sword. He simply documented the insults and sent a formal report to the great Khan Ogdi. Ogdi, back in Karakorum, was enraged. He was furious that his son and nephew had challenged the authority of his chosen commander. He sent back a blistering message. Güyük and Buri were formally recalled, stripped of their commands, and ordered to return to Mongolia in disgrace. This was a massive political victory for Batu. His two greatest rivals were gone. The Western March was now, for the first time, his army. He, his brothers, and the loyal monk were in sole, undisputed command. With the steppe secured, and his rivals banished, Batu turned his gaze to the final symbolic prize. The one city that had been the heart of the Rus for 300 years. In the late autumn of 1240, the unified, rested, and now loyal Mongol army, perhaps 150,000 strong, marched on the mother of Rus cities, Kiev. Kiev was a breathtaking sight, a vast city perched on high hills above the Dnieper River. It was a sea of churches, its golden domes shining in the low winter sun. But it was a hollow jewel. Its prince, Daniel of Galicia, had fled, leaving the city in the hands of a brave but hopelessly outnumbered governor named Dmitr. Batu and his generals, including his brother Berk and the prince monk, rode up to the city walls. They were so awed by its size and beauty that Batu, in a rare move, offered terms. He sent envoys to Dmitr, demanding surrender. The people of Kiev, in a final act of suicidal defiance, killed the envoys. The siege began. This was not a minor campaign. It was the grand finale. Batu brought the full weight of his engineering corps. The Kievan chronicler who witnessed it wrote that the sound of the siege was unlike anything ever heard. It was not the sound of battle. It was the sound of a machine. The air was filled with the creaking of thousands of supply carts, the neighing of tens of thousands of horses, the shouting of the commanders, and above all, the constant, rhythmic, deafening thud of the trebuchets. Batu concentrated his entire artillery corps on one single spot, the Lyadsky, or Polish, gate. 4 days, the stone throwers pounded the wall, day and night, until the thick earthen and timber ramparts finally collapsed. The Mongols, with a roar, stormed the breach. The battle was desperate. Hand-to-hand combat in the streets. The defenders were pushed back, from the outer wall to the inner city. The last stand took place at the oldest and most sacred building in all of Rus, the massive stone church of the Tithe. The governor Dmitr, who had been wounded, was captured. But the people of Kiev, thousands of them, crowded into the great church, seeking sanctuary. They even climbed onto its roof and upper galleries for a final, hopeless defense. Batu and monk, for whom a stone church meant nothing, gave the order. They brought their heavy battering rams and their catapults right up to the church walls. As they began to smash the ancient building, the walls, overloaded with the weight of hundreds of terrified people on the roof, gave way. The entire structure collapsed in on itself. burying the last defenders of Kiev under a mountain of stone and dust. The city was subjected to a sorting of unimaginable cruelty. When the papal envoy, Giovanni de Piene del Carpine, passed through the ruins a few years later, he wrote that the once great city of Kiev was reduced to less than 200 houses. He wrote that his party was forced to ride for days through fields of unburied skulls and bones. The mother of Rus cities was dead. The Rus civilization, as it had been known, was over, and the road to Europe was now wide open. The fall of Kiev in December 1240 was not the end of a campaign. It was the staging point for the next. The city was a smoldering ruin, but its strategic location was priceless. The Rus principalities were broken, their armies gone, their leaders dead. They were no longer a military threat, merely a conquered territory to be taxed. Batu and Subutai, in the dead of winter, now looked west. Beyond the vast frozen marshes of Pripyat and the snow-choked passes of the Carpathian Mountains, lay the next great prize: Christian Europe. Their primary target was not just Europe. Subutai, the master of intelligence, had a very specific, very powerful nation in his sights: the Kingdom of Hungary. To a 13th century mind, Hungary was a colossus. It was one of the great powers of the Christian world. Its king, Bela IV, was a proud and capable ruler. His kingdom was rich, his knights were brave, and his territory stretched from the Carpathians all the way to the Adriatic Sea. But King Bela had made a fatal, arrogant mistake. He had interfered in Mongol business. We must remember Khan Kodian, the leader of the Kipchak tribes. In 1239, as Batu's armies were cleaning the steppes, Kodian and his 40,000 warriors and their families had fled west, seeking asylum. King Bela of Hungary had granted it to them. To Bela, this was a brilliant move. He gained 40,000 battle-hardened horsemen for his army, and a vast new population of souls to convert to Christianity. To Batu, this was a profound, unforgivable act of war. The Kipchaks were, by right of Mongol conquest, his subjects. They were fugitive slaves. By sheltering them, King Bela was harboring stolen property. Batu, as the enforcer of the Yassa, had a legal binding obligation to retrieve this property and punish the man who had stolen it. He had sent a series of messages to the Hungarian king. One, preserved by a chronicler, is chilling in its simple authority. Batu wrote, "I have heard that you have taken the Kipchaks, my subjects, under your protection. I advise you to stop. It is easier for them to escape than it is for you. You live in a house, while they live in tents and can move. How will you catch them?" King Bela, secure in his stone castles, far from the steppes, had ignored the threats. He may have even killed the envoys. Batu now had his casus belli, his ironclad, legal justification for an invasion. He was not just a conqueror. He was a lawman coming to retrieve what was his. But Subutai, the strategic brain, knew the problem. King Bela was not an isolated prince like Yuri of Vladimir. He was a major European monarch. He was related by marriage to the Duke of Poland. He was an ally of the King of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. A simple, direct invasion of Hungary would be a disaster. The Mongols would be bogged down crossing the Carpathians, and by the time they arrived, a massive unified Christian army of Hungarians, Poles, Germans, Bohemians, and Crusader Knights would be waiting for them. So Subutai devised a plan. It was, perhaps, the single most brilliant and complex military operation of the entire Middle Ages. He would not allow Hungary's allies to help. He would paralyze them, and he would do it by destroying them first. He decided to apply the Nerj, the Great Hunt, to the entire continent of Europe. He would split the Mongol army, now numbering well over 100,000 men, into 3, and even 4 distinct corps. They would move on separate paths, coordinated over hundreds of miles, timed to strike at almost the exact same moment. The first and most famous of these was the Northern Force. This was a massive diversionary army, numbering at least 20,000 to 30,000 elite warriors. It was placed under the command of the princes Baidar and Khadan, sons of Subutai and Ogdi. Their mission was pure, calculated chaos. They were to ride north into Poland. Their job was to burn, to kill, and to destroy so fast that no one could react. They were to annihilate the Polish armies. They were to find and destroy the fearsome Teutonic Knights, the German crusading order. They were to draw the armies of Bohemia and the Holy Roman Empire north, making them look in the wrong direction. This northern army was the beater in the hunt. It was designed to create so much terror that all of Central Europe would be focused on Poland, completely unaware of what was happening in the south. Meanwhile, the main force, the Hammer, numbering perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 men, would be led by Batu and Subutai themselves. They would not go to Poland. They would march directly west, straight for Hungary. Their task was arguably the most difficult. They had to move this colossal army, including their siege engineers, through the heavily fortified snow-blocked passes of the Carpathian Mountains in the dead of winter, a feat most European generals would have considered impossible. Subutai's plan was to punch through the mountains before King Bela even knew his Polish allies were under attack. He would isolate Hungary and destroy it, while his northern army kept all of its potential saviors busy, fighting for their own lives. A third, smaller corps under a general named Khadan would even swing further south, through Transylvania, to ensure no help came from that direction. It was a continental-sized pincer movement, a symphony of destruction, all coordinated by messengers on horseback, all set to unleash in the late winter of 1241. The greatest, most complex invasion in history was about to begin. In the depths of winter, 1241, Subutai's grand operation was launched. The great Mongol machine, having feinted south after the fall of Kiev, pivoted and struck west with a speed that defied belief. It split into its designated pincers, a continental-sized net designed to trap and destroy two kingdoms at once. The Northern Corps, led by the princes Baidar and Khadan, was the diversion. But this was a diversion on a scale the world had never seen. They crossed the frozen Vistula River into Poland in February, and the country was immediately plunged into a nightmare. This was not a war of conquest. It was a ride of terror, designed to move fast, destroy armies, and paralyze the allies of Hungary. The Mongol Tumans fanned out. They stormed the city of Sandomierz, massacring its inhabitants. They burned the great ancient city of Krakow. The Polish Duke, Boleslaw, fled in disgrace. The goal was to draw out the Christian armies, and it worked. A coalition of the brave or the desperate assembled to stop them. The Polish Duke, Henry the Pious of Silesia, gathered his remaining forces. He was joined by the elite warriors of the Christian world, the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and a large, heavily armored contingent of the fearsome Teutonic Knights. A massive army of Czechs, led by King Wenceslaus, was marching to join them. Subutai's plan was working perfectly. The armies of Poland and Bohemia were focused north, just as he had intended. On April 9, 1241, near the city of Legnica, Duke Henry's coalition army of 30,000 knights and soldiers formed up for battle. They were a sea of steel, confident in their heavy armor and their massive war horses. They saw the smaller Mongol army of horse archers and prepared for a glorious, crushing charge. Baidar and Khadan gave them exactly what they wanted. The battle began with the classic Mongol opening. The light cavalry, the Mangadai, swarmed forward, showering the knights with arrows. They were annoying, but seemed to be having little effect on the heavy armor. Then the Mongols did what they always did. They broke and they fled. Duke Henry, seeing the cowardly pagans running, made the fatal, predictable mistake. He ordered a full charge. The entire massive disciplined formation of Christian knights broke apart as it surged forward, a chaotic race to win glory and slaughter the fleeing rabble. This was the trap. The knights charged deep into the Mongol lines. As they did, the Mongols unveiled a new weapon, one they had learned from the Jin. They began to burn the dry reeds of the field, creating a vast acrid wall of smoke. The Christian army was blinded, choked, and thrown into total confusion. They could no longer see their banners or hear their commanders. And in that moment, the fleeing Mongols turned. The heavy lancers, who had been hidden in the smoke, slammed into the flanks of the disorganized, exhausted, and blinded knights. It was not a battle. It was a clinical annihilation. Duke Henry the Pious was killed, his head cut off and paraded on a spear. The Knights Templar were almost entirely wiped out. The Mongol army, as was their custom, began their body count. They did not count men. They cut off the right ear of every soldier they had killed. That day, they filled 9 massive sacks with the ears of the dead. The northern arm of Subutai's plan was a complete success. The army of Poland was gone. The army of Bohemia, under King Wenceslas, arrived a day late, saw the field of slaughter, and immediately turned and fled. The entire northern flank of Europe was paralyzed. But Legnica, for all its horror, was just the distraction. At the exact same time, hundreds of miles to the south, the main event was unfolding. The main army, led by Batu and Subutai himself, had marched on Hungary. King Bela IV, secure in his kingdom, had not been idle. He had blocked the main fortified passes through the Carpathian Mountains. He felt safe, believing no army could force its way through in the dead of winter. He had not accounted for Subutai. Subutai did not take the main pass. He sent Batu and the main army to smash through it with their engineers, while he personally led a separate Tumun on a secret, grueling march through an unguarded, impassable pass to the south, through a blizzard. In March 1241, the Hungarian defenses were instantly outflanked. The Mongol army poured onto the great Hungarian plain like a flood. King Bela, in a panic, retreated and began to gather his army, a massive force of 100,000 knights, bishops, and mercenaries, on the west bank of the Sejo River, near the village of Mohi. On April 10th, Batu's vanguard arrived. The two armies stared at each other across the river. The Hungarians felt secure. They were in a massive fortified camp made of wagons chained together, and they held the only stone bridge across the river. That night, Subutai laid his masterpiece. He told Batu, "You will take the bridge. It will be your diversion. I am going to find another way." Subutai, in an incredible feat of engineering, secretly moved a huge force south in the dead of night and began building a hidden pontoon bridge. At dawn on April 11, 1241, just 2 days after the Battle of Legnica, Batu's forces began a frontal assault on the bridge. The fighting was desperate and bloody, but as the Hungarians focused all their elite troops on this one point, Batu's engineers brought up their trebuchets. They fired not at a wall, but at the soldiers on the bridge, clearing it with a barrage of stones and bombs. Batu's men stormed across. But just as the Hungarians began to panic, the real attack came. Subutai's flanking force, having crossed their secret bridge, appeared from the south, smashing into the Hungarian camp from the rear. The Hungarian army was trapped. They were completely encircled in their own camp. A day-long, horrific slaughter began. But Subutai, in a final act of psychological genius, did not close the circle completely. He intentionally left a gap on the western side. This gap was not an act of mercy. It was a funnel. The terrified, disorganized Hungarian army broke. Soldiers threw down their armor and weapons and began to flee, in a desperate, panicked stream, through this one escape route. It was a trap. For 2 solid days, the Mongol light cavalry, fresh and waiting, hunted the fleeing, exhausted soldiers for dozens of miles. It was a running massacre. The entire royal army of Hungary was erased from the earth. The king, the bishops, the nobles, all were killed or scattered. King Bela himself barely escaped. In the span of 48 hours, the military power of both Poland and Hungary had ceased to exist. Europe was defenseless. The battles of Legnica and Mohi were not just victories. They were an extinction-level event for the armies of Eastern Europe. In the span of less than 3 days, the military power of 2 major kingdoms had been erased from the map. King Bela of Hungary, a hunted fugitive, fled south to the coast of the Adriatic Sea, begging the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor for help. Europe was in a state of blind panic. The Pope, Gregory IX, preached a new crusade, not against the Saracens, but against these new Tatars, whom he called the ministers of Satan. The Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, wrote desperate letters to the other kings of Christendom, warning that this was not just a raid, but an apocalypse. And the Mongols did not stop. For the rest of 1241, Batu and Subutai spent the year methodically digesting the Kingdom of Hungary. They hunted King Bela through his own lands. Mongol columns under Khadan reached the shores of the Adriatic, sacking towns in modern-day Croatia. Another force chased Bela to the islands off the Dalmatian coast. By the winter of 1241, Mongol scouting parties were at the gates of Vienna. They were on the borders of the Holy Roman Empire itself. Nothing stood between them and a march to Paris or Rome. Europe was defenseless. And then, in the spring of 1242, the impossible happened. The entire, vast, and victorious Mongol army stopped. They consolidated their forces, turned their horses east, and began a long, organized, and permanent march home. They were not defeated. They were not running. They were simply leaving. The terrified kingdoms of Europe, which had been praying for a miracle, could not believe their eyes. They had no idea what had happened. For centuries, European chroniclers would claim that it was their own prayers, the intervention of God, or the resilience of their knights that had turned the tide. The truth was far more practical. Europe was not saved by a European army or by a Christian prayer. It was saved by a single, exhausted messenger who had ridden 3,000 miles from the Mongol capital of Karakorum. The news this messenger carried was simple. On December 11, 1241, the great Khan Ogdi was dead. Ogdi, the generous, hard-drinking ruler of the world, had died, likely from a stroke brought on by one of his legendary drinking bouts. According to the great Yassa of Genghis Khan, the law was absolute. When the great Khan died, all conquests everywhere in the world must stop. All senior princes of the Golden family, no matter where they were or what they were doing, had a sacred binding duty. They had to return to the Mongol heartland for the great Kurultai to elect the new Khan. This was not optional. To ignore the Kurultai was to commit treason. For a prince like Monk, this was a simple matter of law. But for Batu Khan, this was not just a legal duty. It was a matter of life and death. This news, for him, was a political catastrophe. The new great Khan would be chosen from the sons of the previous Khan. And who was the leading candidate? Who was the man now maneuvering to take control of the entire empire? It was Güyük. The same Güyük who was Ogdi's son. The same Güyük who had publicly insulted Batu, calling him a woman with a beard. The same Güyük whom Batu had sent home to their father in disgrace just 2 years earlier. Batu, the cold, calculating politician, understood the situation instantly. If Güyük was elected great Khan while Batu was still thousands of miles away, sacking castles in Europe, Batu was a dead man. Güyük's first act as ruler of the world would be to declare Batu a traitor. He would strip him of his command of his Ulus, and he would send a new army, not to conquer Europe, but to hunt down Batu and his entire family. Batu's war in the west was over. A new, far more dangerous war was beginning, a war for the future of the empire itself, to be fought in the halls of Karakorum. His retreat from Europe was not a retreat at all. It was a race. He had to get back to a position of power. He had to gather his armies, consolidate his Ulus, and get close enough to the heartland to influence the election. He had to stop his mortal enemy from taking the throne. So, in 1242, Batu gave the order. The European campaign was abandoned at the very moment of its total triumph. The vast army, laden with a continent's worth of plunder, turned around. On their way home, just to show they were not defeated, they casually ravaged the kingdoms of Serbia and Bulgaria. But their destination was not Mongolia itself. Batu was too smart for that. He would not ride directly into his enemy's grasp. He stopped his march in the perfect strategic location: the vast grassy steppes of the lower Volga River, the heart of his father's Ulus. Here, he was far enough from Karakorum to be safe, but close enough to be a kingmaker. Here, he would set up his great golden tent. He would found his capital. He would wait, and he would watch. The conqueror of Europe was about to become the kingmaker of the empire. Batu's return from Europe in 1242 was not a defeat. It was a strategic redeployment. He had marched his vast battle-hardened army, the most powerful single military force on the planet, and parked it directly in the heart of his own Ulus, the lands of the lower Volga. He was now the master of a new empire, soon to be known as the Golden Horde. He controlled the western steppe, the shattered Rus principalities, and the unimaginable plunder of Poland and Hungary. He was the wealthiest, most experienced, and most powerful prince in the entire Mongol world. And he refused to move. Thousands of miles to the east, in the capital of Karakorum, the empire was headless. A new great Khan had to be chosen, and Batu, as the AKA, or senior prince of the entire Golden family, was legally required to attend the Kurultai to oversee the election. Everyone in the empire knew who the candidates were, and everyone knew that Batu's mortal enemy, Güyük, was the frontrunner. But the situation was even more dangerous than that. Ogedi's death had left a power vacuum, and it was not Güyük who had filled it. It was his mother, Toragene Khatun. Toragene, Ogedi's widow, was one of the most formidable and ruthless women of the 13th century. The Yassa dictated that until a new Khan was chosen, the widow of the late Khan would rule as regent. Toragene seized this power with both hands. She was not a simple caretaker. She was an ambitious politician, and she had one single all-consuming goal: to ensure that her son Güyük would sit on the throne. She also despised Batu. She had never forgiven him for the humiliation of her son. The report Batu had sent to Ogedi, which led to Güyük being publicly shamed and recalled, was an insult she intended to repay in blood. The empire immediately split into two factions, two centers of power. In the east, in Karakorum, was Regent Toragene, consolidating her power, appointing her own favorites, and using the imperial treasury to buy loyalty. And in the west, on the Volga, was Batu. He had his army, his wealth, and his unshakable loyalty from his own brothers, like Burke, and his cousins, like the professional monk. A new Cold War had begun. Toragene, as regent, sent summons. She ordered all princes to come to the Kurultai. It was a legal, binding order. Batu knew exactly what it was. It was not an invitation. It was a trap. If he rode to Karakorum, he would be a single prince, far from his army, deep in his enemy's territory. He would be at the mercy of Regent Toragene. He would be pressured, outvoted, and most likely quietly poisoned before he could even cast his vote. So Batu, the cold, calculating politician, made his move. He refused. He did not refuse defiantly. That would be treason. He refused with perfect, calculated, and infuriating excuses. He sent messengers back to the regent, explaining that he could not possibly travel right now. His new lands in the west were still unpacified. He had to secure the borders. And then he added his masterstroke. He sent word that he was ill. He was suffering from a sickness of the legs, likely gout, and was simply too infirm to make the 3,000-mile journey. This was a brilliant political statement. It was a declaration of power. By refusing to come, Batu was deliberately stalling the entire empire. The great Kurultai, by law, could not be held without the presence of the aka, the senior prince. As long as Batu was sick on the Volga, no new great Khan could be legally elected. And as long as there was no new great Khan, Toragene was only a regent, and Güyük was just another prince. But Batu was the absolute, undisputed, and sovereign master of his own vast Ulus. He was a king in all but name. By doing nothing, he was winning. This stalemate lasted for almost 5 years. From 1242 to 1246, the world's largest empire was frozen in the silent, bitter power struggle. Toragene was furious. She sent envoy after envoy. Batu met them with gifts, apologies, and more excuses. All the while, he was using this precious time. He was building his new capital, a great tent city on the Volga called Sarai-Batu. He was organizing his tax system over the Rus principalities. He was solidifying his new state. He also sent his own agents, his own spies, to the other princes. He reached out to his cousin, Monk, and the other sons of Talyui. He reminded them that if Güyük, the arrogant son of Ogdi, took the throne, it would be a disaster for all of them. He was quietly building a rival coalition. This was Batu's political genius. He had survived the family's hatred by being ruthless. He had survived the Great War by mastering both siegecraft and strategy. And now, he was surviving a Cold War by mastering the one thing his enemies could not: patience. He was a rock. He was Batu. He sat in his golden tent on the Volga and forced the entire vast Mongol Empire to wait for him. By 1246, Toragene was desperate. She could wait no longer. She had spent a fortune buying support. She decided to break the law. She announced that the Kurultai would be held, with or without Batu. It was a final, open challenge. Batu's game of patience was a political masterstroke, and it was driving his enemies in Karakorum into a rage. By sitting in his camp on the Volga and claiming to be sick, he was holding the entire Mongol Empire hostage. He was demonstrating with chilling clarity that no law could be passed and no new emperor could be chosen without his consent. For 5 years, the regent Toragene had fumed. But by 1246, her patience finally broke. She had spent those 5 years consolidating her own power. She had dismissed her late husband's loyal ministers and replaced them with her own favorites. She had spent the imperial treasury lavishly, buying the loyalty of key commanders and princes. She now believed she had enough support to bypass the law. She made a high-stakes gamble. She announced that the great Kurultai to elect the new Khan would finally be held in the summer of 1246. And it would be held with or without the presence of the senior prince, Batu. This was a declaration of open political war. A summons was sent to Sarai. It was, in effect, a final ultimatum. Come and bend the knee, or be declared a rebel. Batu, the master politician, received the message. He knew he could not go. To ride into Karakorum now, when Toragene had spent 5 years stacking the deck against him, was suicide. But he also knew he could not simply ignore the summons. That would be treason. So he chose a brilliant middle path. He announced that his illness was, sadly, still too severe for the long journey. It was a tragedy. However, to show his undying loyalty to the empire and the law, he would not leave his Ulus unrepresented. He would send his most trusted proxies. his loyal brothers Orda and Burke. This was another masterstroke. His brothers would be his eyes and his ears. They would travel with a massive, heavily armed retinue, too large to be accidentally assassinated, but small enough to be considered an escort, not an army. They would observe the proceedings, they would protest any illegalities, and most importantly, they would report back to him everything that was said. He was, in effect, bugging the Kurultai. In the summer of 1246, the greatest political show on earth convened near the capital of Karakorum. Temujin had pulled out all the stops. She had summoned vassals from every corner of the empire to witness the power of her son. The king of Georgia was there. The Seljuk Sultan of Rum was there. Even a European envoy, a friar named Giovanni de Pien del Carpine, sent by Pope Innocent IV, was there, having made the long, terrifying journey to negotiate with the masters of the world. What Carpini witnessed was not an election. It was a coronation. The Kurultai was pure political theater, stage-managed by Temujin. Her years of bribery and backroom deals had paid off. Her son, Güyük, was acclaimed as the new Great Khan. In August 1246, Güyük was formally enthroned. The first act of the new ruler of the world was to receive the foreign ambassadors. When the Pope's envoy, Carpini, presented a letter from the Pope asking the Mongols to stop their attacks and embrace Christianity, Güyük, in his newfound arrogance, dictated a famous, chilling reply. He wrote, "You, who are the great Pope, must come in person and pay homage to us. And if you do not, how can we know that you are willing to accept our peace? You speak of peace, but if you do not submit, we will know you are our enemy. And if you become our enemy, we know not, only God knows, what will happen." He had spoken as the master of the world. But his first true priority was not the Pope. It was the man who had not come, the man who had insulted him, who had shamed him, and who now sat in his own vast empire on the Volga like a rival king. Batu's brothers watched in silence as the new Khan, Güyük, immediately began to consolidate his power. He was not his mother's puppet. He quickly turned on her ministers, executing many of the favorites she had appointed. He was securing his own authority. And then, he turned his full, undivided attention to the west. He began to raise a new, massive imperial army. He announced publicly that this army was needed to complete the conquest and to pacify the lands of the west. Everyone in the empire knew exactly what this meant. The lands of the west were the Ulus of Jochi, the Ulus of Batu. Batu's brothers Orda and Burke did not stay for the celebrations. They took their retinues and began the long, frantic 3,000-mile ride back to Sarai. They carried with them the most urgent news of Batu's life. The political Cold War was over. His mortal enemy, Güyük, was now the Great Khan. He was the undisputed legal master of the entire Mongol Empire. And he was using that power to raise an army with one single, undisguised purpose: to march on the Volga, to destroy Batu, and to erase the Jochi problem from the world forever. The report that Orda and Burke brought back to the Volga in late 1247 was not a piece of news. It was a death sentence. The Cold War was over. Batu's mortal enemy, Güyük, was now the Great Khan, the legal master of the world. And his first and only priority was to use the empire's full might to exterminate the Jochid line. For Batu, the time for games was over. The time for illness and political maneuvering was done. This was a war for survival. As Güyük's new imperial army began to form in the east, Batu's sickness miraculously vanished. He was no longer a sick politician. He was the conqueror of Europe. He called his banners. He summoned his brothers, Burke and Orda. He called upon the veterans of the Sit River, of Legnica, and of the Mohi Plain. His battle-hardened, loyal army, the single most powerful fighting force on earth, prepared for war. In 1248, the two largest armies in the world began to march toward each other. From the east, Güyük, the new great Khan, marched west. He led the imperial host, the armies of the Mongol heartland. He was the law. He was the legitimate ruler. In his view, he was marching to put down a rebellious, bastard vassal. From the west, Batu Khan marched east. He was the senior prince. He was the master of his own Ulus. In his view, he was marching to defend his life, his family, and his inheritance from a usurper who had illegally seized the throne. This was the ultimate confrontation. This was the civil war that Genghis Khan had feared, the one he had tried to prevent by choosing Ogdi. Now, the son of Ogdi and the son of Jochi were about to tear the empire in two. As the two armies moved closer, Batu received a secret, urgent message. It came not from a soldier, but from a woman. This woman was, perhaps, the only person in the empire as cunning and politically brilliant as Batu himself. Sorgatani Beki. Sorgatani was the widow of Genghis Khan's youngest son, Talyui. She was the mother of the princes who had served Batu so loyally. The professional soldier monk and his younger, ambitious brother, Kublai. Sorgatani saw the political chessboard just as clearly as Batu did. She knew that Güyük hated her family, the Talulids, almost as much as he hated Batu's. She knew that if Güyük won this war and eliminated Batu, her sons would be next. She made her choice. She cemented the secret alliance that would define the next generation of the empire. She sent a rider to Batu's camp with a simple warning: Güyük is coming for you. His march is a direct attack. Be ready. Batu now knew for certain this was not a tour of inspection. This was an assassination mission on a grand scale. He advanced his armies into Central Asia, preparing for the final bloody confrontation. The two hosts were now just days apart, maneuvering for position near the city of Samarkand. The Mongol Civil War, a conflict that would have dwarfed any war in European history, was about to begin. The fate of the world, from China to the Danube, hung in the balance. And then nothing. In the spring of 1248, just as the vanguards of the two armies were about to make contact, Güyük Khan died. He was just 42 years old. He was in his own camp, surrounded by his own army. He was dead. The news was a shockwave. The official cause of death was given as natural causes, most likely a severe stroke or heart failure brought on by his famously heavy drinking. The same vice that had killed his father, Ogdi. This is the official story, and it is entirely plausible. But the timing was not just convenient. It was miraculous. It was a deus ex machina. Güyük died at the literal last possible second, at the very moment he was about to destroy his only rival. Instantly, rumors flew across the empire. Was it just the drink? Or was it poison? No one could ever prove it. But everyone knew who benefited. Who had the most to gain from Güyük's sudden, convenient death? First, Batu Khan, the man who had been a hunted rebel one day, was by the next the only living senior authority in the entire empire. Second, Sorgatani Beki. Her great rival was gone, and the path was now open for one of her sons to take the throne. We will never know. It is the perfect unsolved mystery. Perhaps an agent of Batu, or an agent of Sorgatani, managed to bribe a cupbearer. Or perhaps Güyük simply drank himself to death at the most politically convenient moment in history. The result, however, was absolute. Güyük's leaderless imperial army stopped. It had no Khan. It had no mission. It simply dissolved. The threat was gone. The news rode fast to Batu's camp. The man who had been bracing for a battle to the death was now, suddenly, the undisputed master of the situation. He had outlived his father. He had outlived his great rival, Güyük. He had outmaneuvered the regent Temujin. His patience, his cold calculation, and his sickness had paid off in a way he could never have dreamed. Batu Khan, the grandson of the guest, the bastard of the Jochi line, was now the single most powerful man in the world. He was the aka, the undisputed senior patriarch of the entire Golden family. The empire was headless again, and this time, Batu would not be the one hiding in his tent. This time he would be the one to decide who ruled the world. The kingmaker. The sudden miraculous death of Güyük Khan in 1248 changed the map of the world. Batu Khan, the man who had been a hunted rebel one day, was by the next the unchallengeable patriarch of the Mongol Empire. The hunted had become the hunter. Güyük's leaderless army dissolved. His widow, Agil tried to have herself declared regent, just as Temujin had done before her. But she had none of Temujin's skill or ruthlessness. The empire was, once again, headless. And this time every single eye in the empire, from China to Persia, from Kiev to Karakorum, turned to one man, Batu. He was the aka, the senior prince of the entire Golden family. He was the conqueror of Europe. He commanded the largest, most battle-hardened army on the planet. And he had just outlived or outmaneuvered every single one of his enemies. He was the law. The path was now wide open for Batu to claim the ultimate prize for himself. He could have marched his army to Karakorum, entered the great palace, and declared himself the great Khan. No one could have stopped him. But Batu did not. He was a cold, calculating pragmatist. Why would he want to be the great Khan? To be the great Khan was to live in the political hornet's nest of Karakorum, to be bogged down in the endless, complex administration of China and Persia. Why would he trade his own new vast empire for that? He already had his kingdom. It was the Western Steppe, the Golden Horde. He controlled the Rus princes, the Volga trade routes, and the plunder of Hungary. He was an absolute autonomous sovereign in his own land. He had no interest in being an administrator. Batu didn't want to be the king. He wanted to choose the king. He needed an ally on the throne. Someone who would be loyal. Someone who would let Batu rule his own Western empire in peace. And someone who would help him, once and for all, destroy the rival family lines that had tormented him his entire life. The lines of Ogdi and Subutai. He had the perfect allies already in place. His secret pact with the brilliant widow, Sorgatani Beki, the mother of the Tululid princes, was now ready to be activated. This was their moment. Batu and Sorgatani, the two greatest politicians of their generation, had a common enemy. The families of Ogdi and Subutai had ruled the empire for 2 decades, and they had treated both the Jochids, Batu, and the Tululids, Sorgatani's sons, with contempt. Batu and Sorgatani decided to stage what was, in effect, a coup d'état. They would rip the throne away from the Ogdi line and give it to their own. But which candidate? Sorgatani had 4 brilliant sons. Batu's choice was immediate and obvious. Monk, the eldest son of Talui, was the perfect choice. He was not a politician or a drunk like Güyük. He was a soldier. He was serious, sober, disciplined, and a true believer in the Yassa. But most importantly, Batu knew him. Monk had served under Batu's command for years during the Great Western March. He had fought in the sieges of Rus. He had been loyal. He had been professional. He had never once joined Güyük and Buri in their insults. Batu respected Monk. He trusted him. The plan was set. Batu, as the aka, had the sole legal authority to call the new Kurultai. And so he did. But he did not call it in the sacred Mongol heartland, in Karakorum, as the Yassa demanded. That was still his enemy's territory. In an unparalleled power move, Batu announced the Great Kurultai would be held in 1250 in Central Asia, on his territory, near his army. This was a constitutional crisis. It was a thumb in the eye to his rivals. The Ogdi and Subutai families were outraged. They declared it illegal. They sent angry messages. A Kurultai to elect the Great Khan can only be held in the homeland of Genghis Khan. They refused to attend. Batu's response was simple: "We are holding it anyway." In 1250, the Batu Kurultai convened. It was a massive assembly, but it was one-sided. It was Batu's entire Ulus, his brothers Orda and Burk, and the entire Talulid faction, led by Monk and his mother Sorgatani. Batu, as the senior prince, stood before the assembly. He publicly renounced any claim to the throne for himself, and then he formally nominated his ally, his friend, his former subordinate, Monk, to be the Great Khan. Surrounded by Batu's veteran army, the election was unanimous. Monk was proclaimed the new Great Khan. But there was a problem. The election was technically illegal. The Ogdi faction still controlled Karakoram, and they refused to recognize it. The empire now had two rival Khans. Batu knew he had to finish the game. He could not leave his Ulus. So he turned to his most trusted and most ferocious commander, his brother Burk. He gave Burk and the Talulid princes command of a massive army. Their mission was simple: you will escort the new Great Khan, Monk, to Karakoram. You will hold a second Kurultai, a legal one in the heartland. And you will ensure that he is placed on the throne, whether our enemies like it or not. Bun 1251, this great army, led by Burk, arrived in the Mongol heartland. The Ogdi and Subutai families, faced with the combined battle-hardened armies of both Batu and the Talulids, were powerless. A second, formal Kurultai was held. The Ogdi faction, in a last desperate move, plotted to assassinate Monk. The plot was discovered. Monk was enthroned. The coup was complete. The reign of the Ogdi line was over. The age of Talui had begun. Batu had won. He had defeated his rivals. He had overthrown a dynasty. And he had placed his own loyal man on the imperial throne. He was not just a kingmaker. He was a dynasty maker. And his reward was the one thing he had always craved: absolute, unquestioned, and total autonomy. He was now the true Khan of the West. The enthronement of Monk in 1251 was not just a political shift. It was a revolution. It was the complete and total victory of the Jochid-Talulid alliance. And Batu, sitting in his great camp on the Volga, was the senior partner in this new world order. He was now, effectively, a co-emperor. Monk, the Great Khan, would rule the East, the Heartland, China, and Persia. Batu, as the aka, the senior patriarch, was the undisputed autonomous sovereign of the entire western wing of the empire. But this victory was not complete until the old rivals were dealt with. And the Mongol way was not to forgive. Monk, with Batu's full and remote backing, immediately unleashed a terrifying and brutal purge. The feud that had haunted Batu his entire life would now be ended, not with politics, but with the executioner's sword. The princes of the Ogdi and Subutai lines, the ones who had plotted to assassinate Monk, the ones whose fathers had called Jochi a bastard, were rounded up. A great show trial was held. The verdict was never in doubt. Dozens of high-ranking princes were found guilty. Many were executed. Buri, the prince who had personally insulted Batu at the banquet, was handed over to Batu's men and put to death. The most horrifying fate was reserved for Güyük's widow, the regent Agil-Kamish, who had tried to rule. She was accused of witchcraft, stripped naked, publicly tortured, and then, in accordance with the Yassa, which forbade shedding royal blood on the earth, she was tied in a sack and thrown into a river to drown. It was a systematic, cold-blooded, and clinical annihilation of the entire opposition. The shadow of Jochi, the taint of the guest, it was all washed away in the blood of his enemies. This final, total victory changed Batu. He was now in his mid-40s. He was no longer the young, ambitious prince, burning with a desperate need to prove his legitimacy. He was legitimate. He was the kingmaker. He was the most feared and respected man in the world. The psychological engine that had driven him to conquer Rus and Hungary had finally, after 40 years, run out of fuel because it had no one left to fight. The relentless ambition of the conqueror cooled. It was replaced by a new, colder, and more complex ambition, that of the statesman. His life was no longer about proving his bloodline. It was about cementing his legacy. He was not just a general commanding a nomadic army. He was the ruler of a vast, complex, multi-ethnic, and multi-religious empire. His subjects were not just Mongol warriors. They were Kipchak nomads, the remnants of the Volga Bulgars, Armenian craftsmen, Persian merchants, and most importantly, the millions of scattered, terrified, and leaderless people of the Rus principalities. This new entity, his Ulus, needed to be more than just an army of occupation. It needed to become a state. This was the true birth of the Golden Horde. It was the moment Batu's personal military retinue, his Orda, which simply means camp or palace tent, transformed into a government. And a government has different needs from an army. An army needs to move. A government needs to be found. Batu, the statesman, faced a new set of problems. He needed to organize the systematic collection of taxes, the tribute, or vikod, from the Rus princes. He needed to establish clear trade routes. He needed a place for his new subjects to come and pay homage. He needed a place for foreign ambassadors, from the Pope, from the Seljuk Sultan, from the German Emperor, to deliver their messages. He could no longer rule this vast domain from the back of a horse. His mobile, nomadic headquarters was no longer sufficient for the complex tasks of imperial administration. Batu, the grandson of the man who had despised cities as prisons and tombs, now needed something his ancestors had never truly had, a center of gravity. A fixed point. This consummate nomad, this master of the open steppe, made the most revolutionary decision of his life. He decided to build a city. He would build a grand, permanent, imperial capital, not in the forests of Rus or the mountains of the Caucasus, but in the most unlikely place of all, in the middle of the vast, flat, treeless grassland, in the heart of the steppe itself. The conqueror, his psychological demons finally exorcised by total victory, had become a statesman. And the first act of this new statesman was to give his new state a heart. Batu needed a capital. He could have chosen any of the great cities he had conquered. He could have ruled from the ruins of Kiev or the rebuilt city of Vladimir. But that would have been a statement of assimilation. It would have meant becoming a Rus prince, a ruler of the forest. Batu was not a Rus prince. He was a Mongol Khan. His power came from the steppe, from the horse, from the Yassa. He would not go to the cities. He would make the cities come to him. So, in the early 1250s, he chose a spot for his capital. It was not in a forest or on a mountain. He chose a spot in the middle of the vast, flat, treeless grassland of the lower Volga River basin, on a branch of the river called the Aktuba. To a European eye, the location would have looked like the middle of nowhere. To Batu, and to a mind like Subutai's, it was the strategic center of the world. This location was not chosen for comfort. It was chosen for control. It was a triple point of absolute power. First, it controlled the steppe. It was surrounded by endless, fertile grassland, the perfect grazing land for the vast herds of horses, sheep, and cattle that formed the foundation of Mongol military and economic life. His armies could be fed, and his warriors could remain true nomads, camped around a central hub. Second, it controlled the river. The Volga was the river road of the Rus. All the wealth of the north, the furs, the honey, the wax, the timber, the slaves, had to float down the Volga to reach the Caspian Sea, and from there, the markets of Persia and the Middle East. By building his capital directly on the river, Batu had built a toll booth. Every single boat, every single shipment now had to pass him. He held the entire economy of Rus by the throat. And third, and most brilliantly, it controlled the Silk Road. The traditional Silk Road had a southern route, through Persia and Baghdad. But there was also a northern route, one that came from China, skirted the Aral Sea, and went west to the Black Sea ports and on to Europe. Before Batu, this route was dangerous and disorganized. By building his new capital, Sarai-Batu, or Batu's Palace, he created a fixed, secure point of commerce. He used his vast army to police the trade routes, to wipe out bandits. He created a Pax Mongolica, a Mongol peace, in his own domain. The result was immediate. The trade routes of the world diverted. They bent toward his new city. Caravans from China, carrying silks and spices, now knew they could travel safely to Sarai. At Sarai, they would meet merchants from Genoa and Venice, who had sailed up the Don and Volga rivers. Sarai became the great strategic choke point of world trade. And Batu, the man who owned the city, taxed every transaction. He was no longer just a conqueror, living off plunder. He was a businessman, living off tariffs. And what was this city? It was not at first a city of stone. It was a Mongol capital. At its center was Batu's own Orda, his great golden tent, a massive opulent gur or yurt, large enough to hold 1,000 people, mounted on a giant wheeled cart, its dome shining with gold. Around this center, a metropolis sprouted. It was a city of yurts, a vast, sprawling camp of tens of thousands of Mongol warriors and their families. But Batu, the pragmatist, knew he needed more. He used the human plunder from his campaigns. He settled the Russian, Hungarian, and Alan artisans he had captured. He invited merchants, Armenians, Arabs, Jews, and Genoese. He built permanent districts for them. He built mosques for his new Muslim subjects, like his brother, Burke, who had converted. And in a sign of his grandfather's classic tolerance, he allowed the Rus to build their own Christian churches. Sarai was a cosmopolitan, chaotic, and vibrant expression of Batu's new power. It was a city built on the steppe, ruled by a nomad, populated by the world, and funded by the control of global trade. This was the final act of his transformation. The shadow of Jochi was gone. The conqueror of Rus was now the Khan of Sarai, a true statesman. He had his own capital. He had his own vast, autonomous, and wealthy kingdom. And he had his own loyal great Khan, monk, ruling the East. He had won. He had proven his worth, not just as a destroyer, but as a builder. The great city of Sarai now stood on the Volga, a testament to Batu's power. It was the center of his new empire. But a capital must administer something. Batu, the statesman, now faced his most complex challenge. How to govern the vast alien land he had just shattered. How to rule the Rus principalities. He was a Mongol. He was a nomad. He had no interest in living in the cold, dark forests of Vladimir or Moscow. He had no desire to learn the complex language, the strange customs, or the petty, squabbling politics of the Rus princes. To occupy that land with his own army would be a logistical nightmare. It would be expensive, endless, and bloody. Batu was a pragmatist. He wanted the wealth of Rus without the headache of Rus. So, from his new capital, he designed a system. It was a masterpiece of remote control imperialism. It was a system of pure, cold, efficient exploitation. Later, Rus chroniclers would call it the yoke. It was not a system of direct occupation. It was a system of vassalage. Batu would let the Rus princes continue to rule their own cities. They could continue to bicker and fight, as long as they did it under his authority. He would, in effect, outsource the difficult work of governing to the local princes. They would do the hard work for him. This system rested on 4 pillars. First, the census, the chislo. Before you can tax a people, you must know how many people there are. In the 1250s, Batu, in full coordination with the new Great Khan monk, unleashed a new kind of terror. Not an army, but an army of accountants. These were the Chislaniki, the numberers. They were Mongol census takers who traveled with military escorts. They went through every city and village of the shattered Rus lands, from Kiev to Vladimir to the gates of Novgorod. They counted everything. They registered every household, every man, woman, and child, every horse, every cow, every beehive. It was a terrifying, invasive, and non-negotiable audit. Second, the tax, the vikod or the yield. Once the census was complete, the tax was levied. It was simple: a tithe, a tenth of everything, a tenth of the grain, a tenth of the furs, a tenth of the silver. And if a city was rebellious, it also included a tithe of the people, who were taken as slaves for the Mongol armies. This was the price for existence. It was the rent the Rus princes paid for the privilege of remaining in their homes. Third, the enforcers, the baskaki. How do you ensure that these arrogant princes, far away in their forest forts, actually collect this tax and send it to Sarai? You watch them. Batu installed his own men, military governors called baskaki or daragachi, in all the major Rus cities. These men were not rulers. They were observers. They were the Khan's eyes and ears. They had their own military detachments, and their job was to watch the local prince, make sure he followed orders, and ensure that every last coin of the vikod was collected and sent down the Volga. If the prince hesitated, the baskak would send a message to Sarai, and a punitive expedition would be dispatched to burn the city. But it was the 4th pillar that was Batu's true political masterpiece. This was the tool that kept the Rus princes from ever uniting against him. It was called the Yarlik. A Yarlik was simply a permit. It was a royal charter, a piece of paper, a patent issued by the Khan. It was a license to rule. Batu declared that no Rus prince was a real prince just because his father had been one. His title was worthless. He had no authority at all, until he came to Sarai and received the Yarlik from the Khan's own hand. This was an act of pure political genius. It completely rewired the power structure of Rus. Before, the princes had fought each other for cities. Now they had to compete for Batu's favor. To be confirmed as a prince, a Rus noble had to undertake the long, humiliating, and terrifying journey to Sarai. He had to enter the great golden tent of the Khan. He had to perform the required rituals of submission, prostrating himself. He had to bring enormous, ruinously expensive gifts, which were, in reality, bribes. And then, he had to convince the Khan that he was the most loyal, most obsequious, most reliable tax collector. Batu would sit on his throne, watching these proud, bearded princes grovel before him. He would listen as they betrayed each other. The Prince of Tver would accuse the Prince of Moscow of plotting. The Prince of Moscow would claim the Prince of Vladimir was hiding tax money. Bisuda had turned their greatest vice, their disunity, into his greatest instrument of control. He made them his informants. He made them his puppets. And then he would make his choice. He would give the Grand Yarlik, the patent for the Grand Prince of Vladimir, the most senior title, to the prince he trusted the most. This prince was now not only a vassal. He was the chief tax collector for the Mongols. He was now responsible for forcing the other lesser princes to pay up. The Rus princes stopped fighting the Mongols. They started fighting each other for the Yarlik. This system was Batu's legacy. It was a machine. It required almost no Mongol manpower to run, and it funneled the entire economic output of a civilization directly into his new capital. And the Rus princes, the men who had survived, understood this new reality. The most famous, Alexander Nevsky, the man who had defeated the Teutonic Knights, made his choice. He knew he could beat a small army of German knights. He knew he could not beat the Horde. So he traveled to Sarai. He bowed to Batu Khan. He accepted the Yarlik and became Batu's loyal vassal, his chief instrument in the north. He made this pragmatic, humiliating choice to save his people from another, final annihilation. Batu's system was in place. The system was in place. The Yarlik brought the princes of Rus to heel. The Baskaki watched over them. The Vaikod tax flowed south to the new glittering capital of Sarai, where it was loaded onto ships and caravans. Batu Khan, the grandson of the guest, was now the richest and most secure ruler in the world. He was the aka the Patriarch. His ally, Monk, ruled the East. His word was law for half the globe. And in these final years of his life, a strange dual legacy began to form. This one man would be remembered by history in two completely, irreconcilably different ways. To the people of Rus, the name Bati was a curse. He was Bati the Godless, Bati the Destroyer. He was a figure of apocalyptic terror, a divine punishment for their sins. He was the man who had burned Kiev, the man whose horses had trod on the altars of their cathedrals. He was the author of the yoke, the monster who had enslaved their nation. To the Rus chroniclers, he was, and would always be, a demonic force of pure evil destruction. But in the rest of the world, in the Persian chronicles, in the Chinese reports, and in the official histories of the Mongol Empire, he was known by a completely different name. He was not Bati the Godless. He was Sarin Khan. This title, Sarin, in Mongolian, means the good, the noble, or most accurately, the just. How could the man who burned Vladimir be Batu the Just? How can these two realities exist? The answer is the key to understanding the Mongol mind. To the Mongols, and to the vast non-Rus populations under his control, Batu was just. His cruelty was never random. It was not the cruelty of a psychopath who enjoyed inflicting pain. It was the cold, calculated, political cruelty of the Yassa. His policy was simple: submit, and I will protect you. Resist, and I will erase you. The Prince of Ryazan and the defenders of Kozelsk had resisted. They were erased. But what about those who submitted? A merchant on the Silk Road, leading a caravan of spices from China to the Black Sea, did not care about the fate of Kiev. He cared about bandits. And under Batu, there were no more bandits. Batu's armies policed the roads. A merchant could travel from one end of Batu's domain to the other, unarmed, and be safer than he had ever been in his life. The taxes were high, but they were predictable. There was one law, one ruler. To that merchant, Batu was not a destroyer. He was a protector. He was the man who brought the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. He was the just Khan. But the single greatest example of this cold, pragmatic justice was Batu's policy toward the most powerful institution in his new vassal state, the Russian Orthodox Church. When Batu's armies stormed the cities, they had shown no mercy. They burned cathedrals and killed priests. The church was the ideological heart of the Rus resistance. But now the war was over. Batu was a statesman. He knew he could not kill every priest or burn every church. The church was the only institution that still unified the Rus people. To continue to persecute it would be to create a permanent underground rebellion. It would guarantee holy wars against him for 100 years. Batu, the pragmatist, did not want a holy war. He wanted taxes. So, he did something that must have stunned the surviving Rus bishops. He did not just tolerate the church. He became its protector. Batu, the godless shamanist, issued a formal yarlik, a legal patent, to the Metropolitan, the head of the Russian Church. This yarlik declared that the Orthodox Church, its priests, its monks, and all of its lands, were completely and totally exempt from all taxes. The vkyhod, the yield that was crushing the princes and the peasants, could not touch the church. This was not an act of piety. It was an act of breathtaking political jujitsu. In one single move, Batu had turned his greatest potential ideological enemy into his greatest ally. The church was now dependent on the Khan for its special, privileged, and wealthy position. And what did the Khan ask for in return? One simple thing: loyalty. The priests, who had once called Batu the Antichrist, now began to preach a new sermon. They preached that the Khan was the new Tsar. They preached that his power was given to him by God, just as the Roman emperors had been. To resist the Khan was to resist God's will. They told the suffering Rus people not to rebel. They told them to pray, to endure, and to pay their taxes to the legitimate God-appointed ruler, the Khan in Sarai. Batu had bought the soul of Rus without firing a single arrow. He had ensured his yoke would be enforced not just by the Baskak's whip, but by the priest's cross. This was the genius of Sarin Khan. He was both the merciless destroyer of those who resisted, and the pragmatic, just, and legal protector of those who submitted. He was the scourge and the statesman. The final years of Batu Khan were not spent on the battlefield. They were spent on a throne. From his great new capital of Sarai on the Volga, he ruled as the Sarin Khan. His yoke system was in place, funneling the wealth of the north into his treasury. His Pax Mongolica made the trade route safe, and his city became one of the great commercial centers of the world. He was, in all but name, a co-emperor. He and the great Khan monk ruled the Mongol world as two great allied pillars. Monk, in Karakoram, focused on the east, launching a new massive war against the southern Song dynasty in China. Batu in Sarai was the undisputed, autonomous, and total sovereign of the West. Monk never interfered in Batu's Ulus. Batu never interfered in monks. It was the perfect pragmatic alliance that Batu had spent his entire life working to achieve. Batu was no longer the warrior. He was the statesman. He received envoys, he managed trade. He oversaw his Baskaki in the Rus lands, and he grew incredibly wealthy. He was the patriarch, the aka, the senior-most member of the entire Golden family. The shadow of Jochi, the taint of the guest that had haunted his youth, was gone. It had been buried under the corpses of his enemies and the gold of his new empire. Around the year 1255, in his late 40s, Batu Khan, the Rock, died. His death was the final, quiet proof of his victory. He did not die in a desperate battle like Duke Henry. He was not assassinated like a prince of the Ogdi line. He was not hunted as a fugitive like King Bela. And he did not die in a drunken stupor like his rival Güyük. He died peacefully, in his own bed, in his own capital, as the undisputed ruler of his own vast empire. His legacy was immediate and profound. His loyal brother, Berk, would eventually take the throne of the Golden Horde, ensuring the Jochid line would continue. The state that Batu had built, the Golden Horde, would prove to be the most durable of all the Mongol Khanates, lasting for another 250 years, long after the great empire in China and Persia had crumbled. But his most complex and most ironic legacy was the one he left in the forests to the north. To the Rus people, he was the scourge of God. He had shattered their civilization. The Kievan Rus was gone forever. The old centers of power, the proud golden city of Kiev and the great capital of Vladimir, never recovered from the devastation he had unleashed. He had, in effect, wiped the slate clean. And into this vacuum, this leaderless, traumatized world, a new power would eventually, slowly begin to rise. It came from a place that Batu had barely even noticed, a small, insignificant wooden fort he had burned in 5 days as an afterthought on his way to Vladimir, the city of Moscow. The princes of Moscow learned their politics from Batu's system. They saw that the old way of the Rus, the bickering, the feuding, the pride, led only to death, to the Sit River and the burning of cathedrals. The Muscovite princes learned a new way. They learned the way of the Horde. They became the most reliable, most obsequious, most ruthless of all the Khan's vassals. They were the ones who traveled to Sarai, who bowed the lowest, who betrayed their rivals most effectively. They were the ones who won the Yarlik to be the grand princes. They became the chief tax collectors for the Horde. They learned to centralize power. They learned to crush dissent. They learned that loyalty and terror were the only true currencies. They learned, in effect, to be Baskaki for the Khan. And when the Horde eventually grew weak, these same princes of Moscow would use the very system of taxation and autocracy they had learned from the Mongols to turn against their masters and build a new, centralized empire of their own. The future Tsars of Russia, the autocrats of the Kremlin, were, in a dark and profound way, the pupils of Batu Khan. This was his ultimate, unintended legacy. He was the conqueror who became a statesman. He was the destroyer who, in his pragmatic quest for order, became the just. And he was the boy born under the shadow of a name that meant guest, who had proven himself, through iron will and cold calculation, to be Batu, the rock, the patriarch of his family, the founder of his own empire, and the man who had, quite literally, conquered half the world.